We're good to go.
Okay. As chair of Division 3 of the House Finance Committee, I find that due to the state of emergency declared by the governor as a result of the COVID.
Hell.
On mute. That as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic and in accordance with the governor's emergency order 12 pursuant to executive order 2020-04 as extended, this public body is authorized to meet electronically. Please note that there is no physical location to observe and listen contemporaneously to this meeting, which was authorized pursuant to the governor's emergency order. However, in accordance with the emergency order, I'm confirming that we are providing public access to the meeting by telephone, with additional access possibilities by video or other electronic means. We are using Zoom video webinar for this remote meeting. All members of the committee and the staff of state agencies with agenda items have the ability to communicate contemporaneously during this meeting through this platform, and the public has access to contemporaneously watch and or listen to the meeting on Zoom or phone, following the directions and links provided in the House calendar from House Calendar 8 to the most current one. Those House calendars can be found on the agenda. So we are providing public notice of the necessary information for accessing this meeting. As I stated previously, you can use a telephone, and the instructions are in the House calendar. We are providing a mechanism for the public to alert this body during the meeting if there are problems with access. If you do have a problem, email us at lba_fiscal, that's fiscal, at leg.state.nh.us. If there's a situation where the public is unable to access this meeting, we will go ahead and adjourn and reschedule. Please note that if we are to take a vote, and I don't expect any, it'll be done by roll call. So, Mr. Clerk, are you ready to take the roll?
I am.
Okay, so when each member states their presence, please state whether there's anyone in the room with you during this meeting, and that's required under our right to know law.
Representative Irv.
Present, home alone in my home office.
Representative Weiler, I'm in Kingston and I'm alone in the room, others are in the house. Representative Bean.
I'm home in Guilford. My wife is in and out of the house. My dog is here.
Okay. Representative Wallner.
I'm home, I'm alone, and I'm in my home in Concord, New Hampshire.
Representative Nordgren.
I'm here in my dining room at my house in Hanover, and I wish I had a dog with me.
Representative Rogers.
I'm here in my apartment in Concord, New Hampshire, and my dog is sitting by my side.
Oh,
Representative Edwards.
So I'm in my home office in Auburn, New Hampshire, with the door closed, dogs and family in the other part of the house, but shouldn't come in.
All division members are present.
Thank you, sir. I noticed we have 26 attendees this morning. To the attendees, what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be listening to DCYF. We're going to be going through their prepared presentation and relevant portions of the budget brief book. And we'll also hit their accounting lines where we'll be asking questions throughout the course of the presentation. Mr. Ripscomb, if you're able to see me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to wave if anyone in the committee has questions. And if they have questions, I'll try not to interrupt you. I want you to finish your thought, and we'll let people ask questions when they have them. For the public, what we've been doing, and it seems to have some benefit and it's been successful so far, is if you have questions, we will open up the floor for you to raise your hand, and we'll bring you in, and you can make your point. And I'll just ask you now, and I'll repeat it later, that if we would like your points to be on specific points relative to our deciding how to resource a given line item. We're past the philosophy stage because we're not a policy board, we're a resource board. So those are the kinds of questions or input that will be most beneficial to us. And then I think I wanted to mention that we've been asked to break at noon. We have one of our key participants needing to step out for a while. So I anticipate a lunch break from noon to about 12:45. And with that, Mr. Ripple, you want to go ahead and introduce Mr. Ripson and we'll get going?
Yep, sure. You have Karen in the meeting and also Joe Ripson, DCYF Director. Is there anybody else that I should bring in, Karen or Joe?
Can you bring over
No?
Rebecca Lorden?
Rebecca Lorden, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, she should be coming in and I think you're all set.
Great, thanks. I will turn things right over to Joe.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Chair Edwards and members of the committee. My name is Joseph Ripson. I'm the director of DCYF. I am alone in my office in Concord. I'm going to share my screen now. And Representative Edwards, I'll let you know whether I can see you once I share my screen. Sometimes when I share my screen, I lose the video of participants. And I can see you, so hopefully that'll, the format you identified will work. So good morning.
I can see everyone, so if they raise their hand, I can see them.
Excellent, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you information about what's been happening at DCYF and the ways that that impacts the decisions that you all have to make about the state budget. Basic identifying information around our budget, budget lines here in the department unique identifier. My contact information is here in case you have any follow-up questions. And then a bit about DCYF. So the mission of DCYF is to partner with families and communities to provide resources and supports that lead to the safety and healthy development of children, youth, and the communities in which they live. And this is our current structure, which if you're looking closely, you'll notice is actually slightly different than what you see in the budget because we restructured things just about a month ago, and we're still in the process of pushing all that through on paper. But the basic structure of the division, myself as the director, my general counsel and legislative liaison, who many of you know, and there's a chart later that identifies all these individuals and their time with the agency. Field services, which is by far the biggest of our operations. That's what people really think of when they think of DCYF. That is all of the field staff and district offices that do child protection and juvenile justice work. Our chief of operations, who oversees 3 of our bureaus, our relatively new Bureau of Professional and Strategic Development, relatively new Bureau of Evaluation, Analytics, and Reporting. These 2 bureaus were split out of a larger bureau that was called the Bureau of Organizational Learning and Quality Improvement. In last year's budget, or last biennium's budget, there was an additional position allocated to us for the purpose of bringing on another high-level administrator with expertise in analytics and evaluation. And we just hired that person about a month ago, which is why we've now broken this former bureau known as Bureau of Organizational Learning and Quality Improvement into 2, because we now have one person who's focused really on our professional development, our training and things like that, as well as our strategic priorities and implementation thereof, and another person who's really focused on the evaluation, analytics, and those types of things, which are key for us as we move into a more sophisticated service array aligned with the Federal Family First Preventative Services Act legislation, and we'll talk more about that later. Also reporting to our Chief of Operations is our business information systems. Those are the folks that oversee our electronic case record. And there is recommended funding in the capital budget for updating that antiquated electronic case record, which is 20+ years old. Work on that has begun, but there's additional resources needed to complete that work in the capital budget. Our Bureau of Community, Family, and Program Support, these are the folks who basically are responsible for managing all of the services and all of the providers that we work with. Also are responsible for some of our discrete supports to the field. So things around foster care, around adoption, around permanency supports for children and youth, our adolescent program for young adults who are of transition age leaving DCYF. Those types of supports are handled out of this bureau. And then the Sununu Youth Services Program, which is the state's only secure facility for detained and committed youth. Bit of an overview, and I think I captured this really in the last slide, so I won't belabor it, but really we have three primary focuses: child protection, which is to investigate and assess allegations of abuse or neglect, and then to work with those families where abuse and neglect is found, to ensure safety, to ensure children end up in a forever family, whether that's by safely keeping those children at home or reunifying those families at home after providing services, or whether that's through adoption and trying to have children find their forever families in another home where necessary. Juvenile justice, which is focused, as I'm sure folks recognize, primarily on delinquency. But we also have services through juvenile justice for what we call CHINs in the state, children in need of services. Some of those CHINs cases are court involved, some of them are not. And some of the data I'll share later makes that distinction, and we can go further into that. And then SYSC, the Sununu Youth Services Center, which, like I said, is the state's only secured setting for detained and committed youth.
So, Mr. Ribson,
Yes.
am I right to think that the Sununu Center is 100% in AU Code 7916 rehabilitative programs?
I believe that's right. Karen, could you?
There are actually several accounting units associated with SYSC, which are all on a future slide.
No other questions here? So a little bit deeper into child protection. This includes child abuse and neglect hotline, right? So people call 24/7, 365 to make reports of abuse or neglect. That's actually relatively new. New Hampshire was one of the last states a few years ago to implement a 24/7 hotline, which it now has. Child abuse and neglect assessments, which are also now 24/7. Again, New Hampshire was one of the last states in the union to implement a 24/7 response on child protection, which we now have. Prior to that, what would typically happen if somebody came in after hours, law enforcement would get involved to potentially remove a child from their home, and then Monday morning our staff would get involved. That's really not ideal. You really want the folks who understand family dynamics and those social workers making those decisions and making those placements. In-home and in community services, which are being really redone, and we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Out-of-home residential services, including relative care and foster care. Residential care is included here, and it's largely paid for out of DCYF's budget, but management of those programs is primarily actually through the Bureau of Children's Behavioral Health, because those programs serve populations that include DCYF, but also could include non-DCYF. And we can talk more about that a little bit later. Reunification services, so those are services to try to help bring families back together when children have had to be removed and to keep those families stable. And then adoption and adoption services, which would include not only securing adoptions for young people where we can't reunify them with their families, but also post-adoption where families who have already adopted are having a challenge. The related statutes to all of this are listed in here for your future reference. Yes.
So are you going to have another slide to talk about the hotline or is this? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I have some data slides ahead which go into some details about these different components. So this is that slide. This is the calls to intake, the hotline, as you referred to it. The data that you're seeing here is primarily coming out of our data book. So there is the 2020 DCYF data book. Last year was the first year we released a data book. We're doing this annually to try to improve transparency and understanding of the system. Let me explain how to read this chart and then explain some of what we're seeing in this chart. So the green line across the top, that's the total call volume to our hotline. You do see that we've had growth in that number up through state fiscal year 20, where we did see some decline in call volume. I do think the majority of that decline is COVID related. Folks will recall that in the springtime, there was a lot of news reports about seriously decreased calls to the hotline as a result of kids not being in the community where they typically are. school callers in particular falling off in call volume, but other providers too. We actually saw decreases in calls from medical providers, calls from community programs, calls from social workers, really almost every category with the exception of law enforcement who was calling at a typical rate, and families themselves, right? A grandparent may be calling on something happening in their child's home, or one parent calling about something happening in another parent's home or something like that. But other than those two categories, we did see decreased call volume starting in March. A lot of that is picked up since. I don't have slides on that in here, but we do have slides on the web that go into all of that, and it's something I can go into deeper if folks want to. The other thing you see in here, which I'm going to go into more on the next slide, is changes in the number of what gets screened in for an assessment. That's this dark blue. The light blue, what gets screened out, and then the number of additional information calls. So what you're seeing here, part of this reduction in what's getting screened in is a COVID impact, but most of what you're seeing there is actually a change in practice. And what we've been doing for the past few years, trying to perfect, and where I think we're finally seeing it play out in our data, is really improving our hotline operations and changing it from a system where historically all we did when we received a call was say, yes, you're screened in, and no, you're screened out, to a system where now we have a third option, which is, yes, you're screened in, no, you're screened out, but this family could use some additional help. And you, as say the teacher, we're going to help you connect with the Family Resource Center to get that family the additional help that they need. This is important for a couple reasons. One, we were conducting investigations on families that really were never going to end up being substantiated. So you end up putting a family through a potentially traumatic situation of investigation unnecessarily, and not connecting them necessarily with the resources that they need. If we're able to do that work at intake, we're able to save some of our bandwidth of staff to investigate those higher risk situations that really require our attention, but we're also able to support communities in supporting their own families without getting child protection involved, which is a scary thing for a lot of families, and we don't want to overutilize that lever when we don't need to. So that work has been going on really for the development work for that's been going on for a couple of years, but the actual practice change has been going on for about a year. So part of what you're seeing here in this shift in screen in and screen out is that exact dynamic. It's the dynamic of a practice shift, but it's also somewhat impacted by the reduced call volume, if that makes sense. All right, I'll move on to the next slide, which goes a little bit deeper into that. So this is Child Protective Services new assessments. You see the assessment volume. Just to orient you to the slide, the green line is oriented to the far right axis, right? So the green line is total new assessments in a year to the far right. These bars are oriented to the left axis. That's assessment by priority response level. I'll explain a little bit about what's happening in both of those too. So you do see for the first time in years a substantial drop in the number of new assessments, which is, in my view, good news. Mostly. Some of this is probably COVID related, as I said on the last slide. This corresponds to what you saw on the last slide, but some of this is because of that practice shift that I was talking about. The other thing that you see happening here, which I think is reflective of really great improvements happening in our intake system, is the numbers of level 1, level 2, and level 3 assessments. Level 1 means a 24-hour response. That means an emergency response. Level 2 is a 48-hour response. Level 3 is a 72-hour response. You see the number of level 1s drop, the number of level 2s remain relatively constant, and the number of level 3s drop. What was happening in prior years was because intake was understaffed, under-resourced, and didn't have the appropriate computer equipment that they needed to do, the appropriate telephone lines that they needed to do, the appropriate analytical structure in order to understand their decision-making processes. All of those things were yielding slow response times from intake and making a decision about whether to screen things in or out. And as a result of that, things that they would have screened in as, say, a level 2 would get screened in as a level 1 because it took them a day to make the decision. Well, now that we've been able to improve operations at intake to eliminate those challenges, we're actually seeing what is, I think, a more appropriate distribution between our emergency responses and our 48-hour and 72-hour responses. And you've seen that play out here in the data with the number of level 1s drop more significantly than even the number of total call volume.
I have a question for you, a couple actually. these questions are related to just getting a sense of scale. And first question, what is the definition of a child in this case?
A child is somebody between the age of 0 and 18.
Do you happen to have any statistics to show overall what is happening to that demographic? I think I've seen in Ways and Means coming out of their graphics that shows the demographic of 0 to 18 is in decline in New Hampshire. Is that
in our data book, and I can pull that up if you would like me to.
No, this is a conversation.
Yep, I do have in our data book data that does show some interesting shifts within our demographics for children. You do see some modest decrease in the number of people under the age of 18 in recent years. I think when the new census data comes out, it'll be interesting because a lot of that's based on assumptions instead of an actual count for the most recent years. The other thing you see is shift in demographics in terms of racial and ethnicity, where we are seeing more people of color in the state than we have, particularly children of color in the state than we have in recent years. And we're seeing growth in different parts of the state, particularly in the southern part of the state.
So it sounds like your data book has a breakdown of region and by various demographics, who your clientele are, and maybe also the total population in that 0 to 18 group in that same region?
Yes, I think the data book actually only has it by statewide. I don't think it breaks it down by regional, but I think we might have that. I think we have that data. It's just not in the data book.
Okay, so with all the emphasis on health equity and equal access to our systems, I'm sure you're tracking that data at that level, just to make sure that we know if we're doing the right thing.
Yes. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, and it's one of these areas, right, where nationally we see disproportionality in child protection and juvenile justice, and we see it here in New Hampshire as well, both again national scale and in this state.
Representative Wallner has a question for you.
Yes, I've heard, and these are just individuals who bring forth a specific case, but I've heard that there have been increases in the number of children who have been referred to DCYF because they've not been attending school. And I'm wondering if you have seen an increase in referrals around children not attending school. And if so, what kinds of resources or things can we do for those families? I mean, I think there's probably a wide variety of reasons why children haven't attended school during COVID. I wondered if you could say something about that.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And yes, that is correct. I actually have another entire presentation on that topic that I could share with folks if they're interested. But we did notice starting in the fall, it's interesting, we did not notice this at all in the spring when schools first closed, but starting in the fall, really dramatic increases both on juvenile justice and child protection around. In child protection, what's called educational neglect referrals, and in juvenile justice, what we call truancy referrals. Really two sides of the same coin. Typically, educational neglect involves younger children, truancy involves older children, although that either population could end up in either bucket depending on the circumstances. We saw really, really dramatic growth in both starting in October. We did a little bit of a qualitative analysis based on that and pulled together some focus groups of the staff who were handling these cases to try to understand what the dynamics were there. And what we were really hearing back was that overwhelmingly, these were not situations where kids were really being abused or neglected, prevented from accessing education because of any parental problems, but rather families who were just really stressed with trying to balance the requirements of, being parents working remotely or not. One of the cases that was brought forward was a woman who was a waitress and had to bring her 6-year-old to the diner every day to do their remote school. And that's not a parent who's abusing or neglecting their kids. That's a parent who's really a hero trying to figure out a really tough situation. So some of the other things that we heard were some challenges with technology. That wasn't overwhelming. It was really the balancing of priorities for parents. We did hear some challenges around certain schools having some pretty draconian policies around what counts as absent or not. for example, one district that would, if a student didn't want to turn their camera on, they would count them as absent for the day. I understand why the school would want the camera on. At the same time, that in that instance, the student was really ashamed of their household conditions and just was not going to be convinced to turn on that camera in front of their peers, which I can understand, and that's not a student who I think needs to be punished for that, right? That's a different type of situation to manage. So, you know, we've seen a lot, but I think at the end of the day, it really comes down to families struggling with these different challenges. I do think, you know, given the huge rise that we've seen in this remote learning environment, I do think the remote and hybrid learning is probably the driving factor in this. We did give some advice to the school districts. We had a forum. DOE helped us pull together the school districts where we saw this shift occurring most frequently 2 weeks ago. And we hosted a forum for those school districts where we shared all this data, shared these stories, and gave them some advice. A lot of that advice was around just really making sure they're utilizing their guidance counselors and social workers to troubleshoot before they're making referrals to us. Because as I said before, when we go out, that can be a scary experience. And while we, I think, are pretty good at problem solving with families, it would be nice to have these families and others be able to solve these problems directly. One of the other pieces of advice we gave was contacting their local family resource centers. Many of them were willing to assist with families in these positions. We shared again with them something that we developed last spring and updated in December called the Child and Family Wellbeing Guide. That was a tool that we created at the start of COVID that on the front of it basically acknowledged that all families were struggling now, and provided a host of questions that people could ask to kind of talk to families about what their needs are. And then on the back gave them a list of resources that they could connect those families to, with the idea being that we wanted our teachers, but not just our teachers, our communities as a whole, to be able to connect with families and help families meet their needs. Hoping that that would prevent some of the deeper end stuff that we see when families are neglected for a long period of time. The last recommendation on that sheet was, though, that I would hope schools would try to find ways to get those kids in school, right? Even if they weren't ready to open up entirely, that kids that they're so worried about that they're referring for truancy and educational neglect based on absenteeism. It's a relatively small population compared to the entire school population, and probably is a population that they need to think about prioritizing as an at-risk population to be in person. And I think largely the districts who were present were receptive to all of those ideas. And I would say all of them seemed like they were really working hard to try to problem solve these things. I didn't get the sense from anybody that they were indifferent to this problem.
Thank you. I wondered if I could have just one follow-up. Can you give me just a ballpark figure of how many calls you did have about educational neglect?
If the chair wouldn't mind, if I pull down this presentation and pull up another one, I can give you the exact figure. Off the top of my head, I don't remember it.
Can you wait for that, Representative Wallner?
Oh, yes, anytime, that's fine. Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, I think we're clear. Just to foreshadow my questions when we get to the spreadsheets, it looks like with your workload going down, general funds are going up quite a lot in the governor's budget, but it looks like most of that's offsetting declines in federal budget. So it'll be after lunch before we talk about that, and I just didn't want to forget that I wanted to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, and one other thing I would add on that point when we get to it is that the system still isn't right-sized, right? The system was way under-resourced a few years ago, and the right resources were put in place to help us build that out. But as you'll see as we go further into this, hiring, retention have been a challenge, and we still have more work to do. And one of the ways we measure that, and it's also in here, is through looking at caseloads of staff. So even though there are fewer assessments today than there were then, I don't think we're in a position where we have too many staff to meet the demand. And you can see that when we get into actually this chart right here, the assessment caseloads. So national standards around the caseload that a caseworker should have in a child protection work when they're doing assessments or investigations is 12, and that is a national standard. It is not. This has not been tested specifically for New Hampshire. a couple of years ago when this conversation started happening, we did talk about having a workload study done to develop a specific one for New Hampshire. Ultimately, at that point, in that piece of legislation that was stripped out and not funded. So we didn't do that with the recognition in that committee hearing that people thought the national standard of 12 sounded like an appropriate caseload. And I am comfortable with that, but I would say that in New Hampshire, you know, we expect our caseworkers to do things that we don't in other jurisdictions. You know, in, for example, in New Jersey, where I came from, our caseworkers didn't have to do much work on complaints and pleadings because there were paralegals employed to do all that work. We're here, our caseworkers have to carry a lot of that work because we don't have those paralegals in place. But at any rate,
what I think you're saying is that the definition of what's in a case to create caseloads, it varies by state, and that anecdotally, you just said our cases are heavier because we're asking them to do more work than the states you're familiar with.
that's correct. Exactly right.
Okay. And so you probably thought about how our definition of a case really does compare nationally, so that we're not just, you know, naively looking at the number 12, but we're actually understanding what that means.
Yes, yeah, and as I said, we did when we first started having this conversation about 3 years ago when I moved to New Hampshire and took on this job. That was one of the things that we sought to do, but ultimately we decided not to invest in that type of workload study.
All right.
And
Thank you.
I don't know if you want to take that before I move on.
Oh, Representative Weiler has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, this is a huge reduction in caseloads. Will we see further on what this has accomplished? Will there be more cases closed, more cases dealt with? Will there be an improvement in the overall health of our children?
Yes.
This reduction.
Yes.
And
Yes.
is that going to be something we see?
Yes to all the above.
Thank you. Thank you.
The caseloads, you know, really in January 2016, it being over 90 is something that is absolutely unheard of nationally, right? With the target being 12, to have somebody carrying 90 cases on average around the state is unfathomable. What you really want to get to with a caseload of 12 or whatever that lower number is the opportunity for our assessment workers, for our investigation workers to be able to do more than simply say yes, abuse occurred or no, it didn't, but to actually start to problem solve with the family, identify what their needs are and meet their needs. And actually within the context of these educational neglect cases that Representative Wallner just raised, I'm getting great feedback from folks about what they're seeing there. Those are complex cases, not because they're abuse or neglect, but because the social workers have to do a lot of work to problem solve and connect with different folks in the community to wrap around that family to make sure that that issue gets resolved. But ideal child protection practice allows for that, allows for caseworkers to do that. And if they have a caseload of 12, they can do that. If they have a caseload of 40, which is where we've been for most of my time here, it's impossible for them to do that. So you do see this rapid reduction. Certainly the reduced call volume from COVID was part of this, but part of this is also that change that we talked about at intake. Part of this is the new positions that we received in the last biennium, that we've hired, that we've trained. It takes a number of months to train someone once they're hired before they carry a case, so there's delay. But you do see this decrease really starting, you know, back here in 2019, in the fall of 2019, right after those first people were hired in July of 2019. And then that decrease really continuing to sustain and then really speed up through the springtime as folks were hired. And now really has been sustained over the past couple months. I do expect it's going to continue to improve. I actually think that if we maintain the current staffing positions, that eventually we will get to that target of 12. We've gotten to the point now where the reductions are harder to come by in caseload. And when I say that, that's because when we were up here, there was this huge backlog, right? Staff were triaging who were they going to pay attention to on a given day? And then things that were less risky by definition were kind of being backburnered and weren't closing. So a lot of this big number here is because of things that are left open that really could have closed if people had the bandwidth to close them. We've now gotten through that problem, which is where we are today, this kind of status, this kind of a 17-ish number. And really pushing further down is going to require us to get the rest of these positions filled, trained, and carrying cases it's not going to be as simple as kind of cleaning up the backlog, which is what a lot of this decline was.
Representative Waller.
So I mean, I like that we're caseload is declining. We seem to be accomplishing what we set out to do. But what bothers me is that it's low during COVID. And you're anticipating that when children go back to school and they're out more into the community, and that those caseloads will go back up. Does the budget account for higher caseloads, but still trying to target a 12 caseload load for a worker?
Yeah, so when we calculated the number of staff that we needed to do both child protection assessments, which this is, and then the next thing we're going to talk about is child protection family services, that was based on data at the start of the last biennium, which was a lot higher than what we actually see right now during COVID, in which, given the changes in practice at intake, I would expect to be able to absorb kind of any post-COVID bump that we see. I'm actually not sure that we're going to see a big post-COVID bump, because we've seen our call volume really resume to pretty close to typical levels in the past few months. Now that kids are, even though they're not maybe in person, they are back in school a little bit more, they're interacting with communities a little bit more. So we've seen our call volume get pretty close to normal, even though not entirely there in the past couple months. So I do think that the positions that are identified in the budget will allow us to get to the caseload standards of 12 and 10 for family service that we're going to talk about next. There were some that were unfunded in the initial budget that I do think are going to be necessary for us to achieve that goal. I also believe that the governor sent a letter yesterday within which he articulated support for funding those positions going forward, even though they weren't in the original proposal. So, I'm hopeful that we see that resolved through the budget process. And I do believe that if all those positions are funded, and if we just keep the hard work of trying to hire and train and keep people, we will have the resources we need to get there.
Just to follow up, is that the 22 positions, is it 22 positions that are unfunded?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you very much.
Representative Nordgren. You're on mute.
So are you anticipating, good morning, Mr. Ribson. Are you anticipating much change after we get past this COVID? I mean, I think the issue is probably that the cases are maybe more complicated, but are you anticipating more of a flat line for the end of the summer? Or the other comment I guess I would make is, one of the issues we had when we first came into this with the last budget was that you were having trouble with retention of staff because everyone was just so overwhelmed. Has that gotten better, and are you more able to keep the staff you have? Thanks.
Thank you. Yes. So I do, right, I think what's a little unique about New Hampshire compared to some of the other jurisdictions, and this last chart kind of shows it, I have other data that shows it better, but compared to other jurisdictions, our number of calls coming to the hotline and the number of new assessments were on a huge upward swing prior to COVID, not based on anything related to COVID, but based on what you see in many jurisdictions when you get into a point where you have a lot of attention around high profile fatalities and a lot of risk averse behavior, which leads to a lot of assessments and sometimes unnecessary assessments, which is why we made that shift at intake that I spoke about earlier. So what I would anticipate is I certainly would not anticipate our post-COVID state getting any higher than our, say, state fiscal year 2019, which was a record-setting year historically for us in terms of new assessments. And when we created the number of positions that we needed in the last biennium, that's the data we were looking at. So I do think, again, that the current number of positions within the budget, assuming the funding of those 22, is appropriate and adequate to get us to the caseload standards that we all want. The other issue that you touch on, Representative Nordgren, and I'll talk about a little bit more later, around turnover, we have seen improvement. There's data in the data book that does show, the turnover rate shifting from about 20% to about 17% in terms of people leaving the agency. That's still not a number I'm satisfied with. A healthy organization of our size, you would anticipate something like a 10% turnover rate. I would anticipate seeing that in the coming years. I think the driving factors for turnover are a few. One of them is caseloads and people not feeling that they can be successful in their work. With caseloads going down, I think there's some more satisfaction around that. I think the other component of that we're actively working on is redesigning our services for families. That's an integral component to make sure that folks can be successful in their work, which is why they stay, right? People who come into this work do it because they want to help families. And if they don't feel successful, it's just too hard to bear day in and day out. When we have those services that we're redesigning totally in place, I think people are going to feel even better satisfaction from the job. The other big thing is what we kind of call our safety culture work that we're actively engaged in. And that's around creating an environment where folks feel safe. And I don't just mean physical safety, which is one component of it, but I mean psychological safety and support. One big component that was funded in the last biennium, which has been amazing, was the hiring of a clinical person whose job it is to look for the secondary trauma needs of staff and support staff around those issues, right? Our staff see a lot of really scary, horrible things that can really, haunt the person, haunt any normal person. And it's hard for them to stick it out without that type of support. So that has been invaluable. I'm really grateful that was provided in the last biennium. It's funded in the next biennium in the proposed budget. I hope that it remains through the legislative process. It's been fabulous. The other piece of that is really working around the culture to create what's kind of called psychological safety, or an environment where people can speak freely and openly about what their needs are, what their fears are, what their risks are, not just about themselves and their work, but about the families that they work with. And that's something that when you have a system like ours was a few years ago, where it's constantly under scrutiny, people get very risk averse and get afraid to talk because they're afraid they're going to get in trouble. And changing that dynamic is really imperative, not just to satisfaction, but also to making sure we get the right information to make the best decisions for kids and families. So we've been actively working in that space as well. The new clinical person is a big part of that team. We have another role called a safety culture specialist who's part of that team. And they're part of a national collaborative actually called the Partnership on Child Safety, which includes jurisdictions from across the country that really are focused on these issues. And how do you make sure that you support your workforce appropriately to enable healthy decision-making and good decision-making for families. So all that's to say is I do think it's going to get better, but we're not there yet.
So this is just a yes or no question, and maybe a conversation offline someday, but you have a clinical psychologist who's providing, sort of frontline support to the employees. It sounds like that's very much of a EAP function. And are you convinced that you need that to augment the state's existing EAP program?
I am convinced that it's absolutely necessary, yeah.
It sounds a little redundant, but you're able to justify the redundancy?
Yeah, I think I think that there's a unique set of challenges that our staff face that are discrete from what most folks face. Now, is it possible to structure some of that within EAP? But EAP, as it's currently structured and currently resourced, doesn't have the bandwidth to meet that need for us where this individual does.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so as a case moves on, so as you move beyond the assessment phase, a number of situations will be found where abuse or neglect has occurred, or where children and families are deemed to be at very high risk, and the next level will open up. A family service case is what we call that. Overwhelmingly, these are cases that go to court. So where you saw the big numbers on the prior slide about assessments, that's obviously a much bigger number, because few of those cases will reach this point where they actually go to court and where there's an open, ongoing case. The numbers that you see here on the green line are the total number of family service cases in a given year. You do see the growth and then kind of the stability over the past state fiscal year. What you also see here is the number of children served, right? There are more children in a case than one typically, right? So you'll have the number of cases might be 1,500, but the number of children served, is close to 3,000, because you often have 2 or more children in a case. So the other thing that this slide shows, in addition to the number of family service cases, is the number of children who are being served in those cases, the number of children who are being served in out-of-home care, the number of children being served in-home care. And this has been a priority for us in the past few years. I think New Hampshire had a practice of over-relying on family separation, over-relying on removing children from homes where it wasn't necessary. If you could provide supports and strength to those families to strengthen them and keep those kids safe in their own homes. So I'm happy to see the number of in-home cases, higher than it was in those prior years. And the number of kids who are in out-of-home care, starting to tick down after, growth year after year after year.
So what do you think your best case scenario is for this distribution of kids staying in their homes?
I would like to see these numbers flipped, right? I'd like to see more in-home than out-of-home. A lot of this depends on how you count it, right? So the way that we counted this work in New Jersey, we'd say 85% of our kids are in home, but that would be misleading because it was also counting things like kids who were engaged in assessments, who were being worked in their own homes, or kids being engaged in something like what we would call community-based voluntary services here that I can talk a little bit more about later. So I don't think we'll get to something like that, the way that we count this distribution in New Hampshire, but I do think we can get to a point where we see these 2 bars flipped, and that's what I would hope to see in the coming years as our new services come on the line to better support kids at home.
Thank you.
So this is the family service caseloads. Our goal here is 10. The reason why the goal here is 10 rather than 12 as it is for assessment is that these are family service cases are almost always in court. These are the families that we have identified are in high risk. Kids are either removed from home or there's really, really intensive work happening with those families in their own homes. And just frankly, the work is heavier on a family service caseload on an individual case than it would be on an assessment caseload. So the target here is 10. You do see that number, as the number of kids in out-of-home care grew, really was kind of popping around close to 20. And still today is kind of bouncing around in this 13, 14 range. Part of the reason why you've seen less decline here than you see on the other chart is, as I said before, that other chart has had a lot of noise in it from overdue things and things that were just kind of on the back burner, where none of this work can be backburnered because by definition, all of these families are at high risk, are deeply involved into the system. So I do think that as we continue to hire, we do have the right staff load or the right staffing to get down to the target of 10. But we still see that this is something that we have to keep working at to get down to that number. The red line on above is just the number of children in those cases.
I'm a little confused about that.
Sure.
Your department, as competent as everyone might be, you can't control the number of cases that go to the courts because that's driven by family dysfunction.
Correct.
So you're reacting to something you can't control, I would think, but you made it sound like you can positively influence a reduction in that number.
Yes.
I don't get that.
Yes. I think it is true that we can positively influence a reduction in that number. And that is through being able to provide more preventative services up front, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But if we're able to do things like the things that are currently underway, for example, the system of care work in children's behavioral health, the work that's expanding through family resource centers and family and the facilitating organization, the work that's expanding through public health and community collaboration grants, all of those things, and that work that we're doing at intake to try to direct families who are lower risk to a community resource before they become high risk, all of those things will drive these numbers down over time. And I've experienced that through my work in New Jersey for the decade prior to coming here, that as we built out those supports for families, the number of kids going into out-of-home care plummeted from thousands a year to over 10,000 a year to I think around 4,000 a year today. So I do think that you actually can positively impact these challenges around family dysfunction. But to do so, you really need to think much more proactively than the way a child protection system is typically designed, right? Child protection is typically designed to be reactive. And you really need to work with our partners to be more proactive in order to get in front of that.
So are you basing that projection on your anecdotal experience, or do you think there's peer-reviewed research to indicate that systems of care in this area can be accountable for a reduction in cases in court?
I'm
I'm
not sure
trying to get the difference between
Yeah.
good theory, good experience, and good data.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the research is specifically on it. What I can tell you is I worked in a system that built all of these things around the time that I started there 15 years ago. And through the period of building all those things, we saw a rapid and sustained and still happening today decline of children entering out of home care. And when I say rapid and sustained, I don't just mean, a 10% reduction. I mean, from 12,000 kids to about 4,500 kids today in New Jersey. And the change that happened was the investments in the system of care and the investments in other preventative supports. In New Jersey, we called them family success centers. Here we call them family resource centers. But those were really the two main things that we did to drive these numbers down, in addition to the work around improving the services that are offered within the Child Protection Agency itself that we're currently engaged in.
Thank you.
So this is the number. This is just a different way to look at that same data. The number of children point in time. The last chart showed you kind of cumulatively over the year, but at point in time, so you can imagine on any given day, this is what you see. This can be, it's a helpful way to think about it. It's also a little bit misleading because on one given day, a number could be a little bit off. This is just looking on the first day of the reporting period. But it does give you a sense of kind of on any given day, you would expect, about 1,070 kids who are in out-of-home care and child protection, and about 500 or so kids who are in-home care and child protection. We do see that rapid growth that occurred in out-of-home care that I talked about that really coincides with what I think was a lot of risk aversion being driven by the attention through those high-profile fatalities, and then us finally being able to come over that hump and starting to stabilize. I'm not satisfied with this number, this 1067. I think this can be a lot lower than it is. I think what's going to help us get a lot lower what it is the work that we're currently engaged in redesigning the services that we provide to families who are in the deep end of the system. We can talk more about that a little bit.
So I have a quick anecdote to share with you, and I'm just trying to figure out if this kind of thing affects your data. A friend of mine left his 5-year-old son in the car for a few minutes. He was assured of the kid's safety, ran in, ran out. He says he was away from the car for 5 minutes. Somebody called the police department. The police department went to his house and asked him some questions. So based on that scenario, do you open a case for that?
It would be incredibly unlikely that if that's the only factor that we definitely wouldn't open a case, right? A family service case. Maybe an investigation could be opened based on that information. But the idea that would then, if those are the only factors, that would move beyond the investigatory phase into a case, yeah, absolutely not. That doesn't reach that threshold.
Okay, so mere investigation doesn't constitute a case.
That's right. Yeah, and if you look at the distinction between, right, the numbers on this page again, right, where you're talking about, 1,500 cases a year compared to the assessments, where we're talking about 10,000 in the last year, right? That's the gap there. That's what we're talking about.
Thank you.
And I think there was another question.
There is, Representative Weiler.
I was a little confused between this chart on page 12 and then later on the chart 18. Look very similar, but showing different numbers.
I think 18 is referring to juvenile justice. So when we get into that place.
So these are more serious cases.
So this is talking about child protection cases. This is where a child is potentially removed from their home because the parent because there's some concern about the parent and the safety in the home. Juvenile justice cases are typically related to delinquency and or CHINs, which is, you know, child being a danger or risk to others.
All right, a little more serious. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any other questions.
So this is getting a little bit into the questions that folks were asking around hiring, retention, and things like that. Basically, what you're seeing in this chart is the net change in CPSW positions in a given month. What we're doing here, just so you understand, is looking at this data in the next chart, right? So this column, the new hire column, that's how many new people were hired during that month or that year, how many people left the agency during that year or that month, and how many promotions. And the reason we include the promotions is because that does have an impact on the number of people providing services. The positions that were added in the last biennium, which we needed in order to have more supervisors to supervise these staff, those were typically hired from within, right? So that then creates a vacancy at the frontline position that then needs to be filled. But what this does show is that I think we are making progress every single month and getting closer to our goal of having full staffing. We still do have, you know, last year was almost 100 new hires, which is, you know, a record-breaking year for us. I think I'm pretty proud of the work that was done to hire almost 100 new people. Last year, we had 40 people who left the agency outright and 15 who were promoted to other spots. So your net there would be, you know, a 55 out of 97. So you only, even though you hired 97 people, your net gain was only, you know, 30, whatever that turns into when you do the math. But all that's to say is I do think we are continuing to make progress and that we will be able to continue to fill all the positions.
So I look at this and I have about 2 or 3 questions for you. They're all kind of related. So to what extent is your age force graying out and getting really close to retirement, which would then trigger yet more need to hire? And to what extent is the skill set that you're looking to hire actually available in New Hampshire already? Because we found in some other areas in healthcare, we need to hire people that just don't exist. So
Yep. Yeah, I think 2 things. I think the child protection workforce is actually relatively young at this point because there's been so much turnover and so much new hiring. Our real challenge around the child protection workforce is having enough seasoned staff to be mentors at this point. The juvenile justice workforce is a different dynamic. They're a much more seasoned workforce than our child protection workforce. The other question around having the right folks in the state to hire, I do think that's a challenge. I think not only are we looking to hire folks with social work, either social workers or with skills comparable to social workers, but there are a lot of other folks who are looking for those same type of skill sets right now. So I think there is some scarcity in terms of folks. I would say though, with the fact that we've been able to hire 97 in the last year and probably received 1,000 applications, that I think we'll get there. It's just going to keep taking us time. Yeah, that's it.
So to what extent are you having success or are you having challenges related to hiring a workforce that reflects the community they're serving?
I think that is a challenge. I don't have the demographic data on our workforce, but our workforce, probably particularly in certain parts of the state where we have greater Latinx populations and greater African American populations, I don't think our workforce is particularly reflective of those demographics, and that's something that I'd like to see changed. I think it's really critical in all of these roles to hire people from their home communities, though, and that also includes, other than racial and ethnic, but having folks from the North Country working in the North Country makes a difference, right? It's having people who are reflective of their community and their community values, I think, really helps in that community relation aspect of the work.
So Representative Wallner has a question.
I just wondered, what is your vacancy rate at this time and how many vacancies do you have?
I think at this moment there are 30, I'd have to double check. It's somewhere in the high 30s, I believe, of vacant CPSW positions.
Okay, and just to do a time check, we've been talking for about an hour. You're probably behind where you thought you'd be at this point. So just mentally, if you could plan on shutting down for in about 25 minutes so that we can take a graceful break for lunch.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right, so now we're moving out of child protection into juvenile justice, assuming no other.
I'm sorry. Representative Wallner, your hand is still up. Do you have a follow-up?
No, I'm sorry. I just need to lower it.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Great. So moving into juvenile justice works around delinquency, right? So children commit acts, are found to have committed acts that would be, criminal if adult. Children in need of services, CHINs, they can be both voluntary and involuntary. The distinction here, an involuntary CHINs case typically always involves court. If the CHINs case is going to require a placement under New Hampshire statute, it must involve court. And there are standards that have to be met to qualify for what's called an involuntary CHINs, largely around the child's behaviors, being dangerous to themselves, to others, to their families. Voluntary CHINs cases are often what we see in, say, a truancy matter. So we talked earlier about the truancy cases that are coming in. The way that actually often plays out is, rather than a court case involving truancy, is we receive a call from a school saying, this young person is truant. We need to get services in place to try to get them re-engaged in their community and in their school. And we open up what's called a voluntary CHINs case to work with that family without taking them to court. Sometimes truancy cases do end up in court, but the vast majority of them end up in this voluntary CHINs space. In-home and in community services includes, some youth in residential care. Oftentimes, when the vast majority of times, if the youth in juvenile justice ends up in out-of-home care, they're going to a residential program rather than a foster home. Support for permanency of youth, that's really around if kids do get placed out of home, trying to make sure that they can return to their home communities, or for some reason they can't return to their parents, that we work with other family members that they can return to.
All right. Representative Wallner has a question.
Yes, thank you. Do you keep statistics on the number of children who show up in the juvenile justice system who were at one point or another in the child protection system?
I don't have that handy, but we can pull that data, and there is quite a bit of a crossover population.
I would at some point like to see that, not now, but that would be interesting to see how many children have been in, who are moving from one system to the other.
Yep, and it sometimes moves either way, sometimes
Yes.
from one to the other, and but yeah.
Thank you.
So here's juvenile justice services open cases by state fiscal year. You do see some decline in new juvenile justice cases over the past couple of years. I do think state fiscal year 20 is anomalous because there was a huge drop in juvenile justice cases when schools closed in March, even more pronounced than we saw on the child protection side. And I think that just speaks to an awful lot of the juvenile justice delinquency concerns really stem and originate out of issues happening within schools. But we have seen some decline in the number of juvenile justice cases across the board over the past couple of years. You do see here the dark blue, youth served in placement out of their homes, typically in residential programming, and youth served in their homes. I am glad to see that the number of youth served in their homes is a lot higher than the number of youth served out of their homes. And actually, if you look at the placement numbers, some pretty good progress in the past couple of years of trying to serve more kids in their own homes rather than serving them within a residential placement. This is just breaking down that data by the case types. So we talked about delinquency, right? That's child commits an act that would be considered a criminal act where they're an adult. CHINs cases, which are those cases that I was talking about, child in need of services. The green are the CHINs cases with court involvement. So they often do incorporate some type of out-of-home residential placement. CHINs without court, which are those voluntary CHINs that I was talking about. And you do see the number of delinquency cases dropping. You do see your CHINs kind of growing or staying steady during this period. Again, I think state fiscal year 20 is anomalous and hard to really look at as part of a trend because so much of that was impacted by the onset of COVID. But even through that, you do see that the court CHINs cases maintained and actually have had some slight growth over the past few state fiscal years. So these are our juvenile justice caseloads. We're looking for about 15 here. I don't put a target on this one because I don't know of a good national standard for this. So I haven't identified the target, but what we try to work towards is a caseload of 15. And you do see, largely in JJ, they've been able to maintain around that number. You do see it a little bit lower over the past, year or so, in this COVID period where the numbers have been lower. This is the chart that Representative Weiler was raising, talking about youth, juvenile justice services, youth and open cases. So on juvenile justice, the number of youth point in time, so at the start of the reporting period, so January 1st, with an in-home juvenile justice case, we actually see some growth there. And really what's driving that growth is those truancy cases that we were talking about, the voluntary chins truancy cases, which you don't see in this chart yet, because this is state fiscal year data. So this only goes through July, but you do see it in here where we went through January. And you do see the steady decline of use of residential care, right? 116 JJ kids in out-of-home care, which is good news. That might be overstated as a trend a little bit right now because there are also restrictions due to COVID on getting children who need higher levels of care into those programs. So some of that might be a little exaggerated in the data. We'd have to see, where that plays out as we kind of move out of this COVID period. And then this is, something that I'm really excited about. I'm hopeful we're able to move forward with this. Some juvenile justice transformation work. There is a Senate bill which hasn't yet had a hearing, Senate Bill 94. I put the plus there because there's some other things that aren't related to that bill involved in this work. But some folks might recall that, maybe 6 months prior to COVID, that seems to be the way that we identify the world now. A group of us were awarded an opportunity to go down to Georgetown University, work with national experts around juvenile justice, and think about how do we re-envision our juvenile justice system to better meet the needs of youth. The folks who went on that trip, it was a multidisciplinary group. They're all identified here. Did include somebody from the public defender's office, included our child advocate, the diversion coordinator for the state, Judge Ashley from the circuit courts, as well as a prosecutor from Manchester. And through that work, we really identified two big, broad goals that we're trying to achieve in the coming years. Senate Bill 14 helps with one of those big goals. Number one is offering the opportunity to have law enforcement refer youth to us for an assessment. That's not going to be like a big child protection assessment, but rather an assessment of the youth's needs. And then being able to allow us to use that opportunity to connect those youth with the appropriate services in the community before the petition ever has to be filed. The idea being that if we divert kids at that point, catch them earlier, at that point, we can divert them from the formal court systems, drive down the number of formal court cases that are involved, and get kids the help that they need sooner, which in the long run should both reduce the number of delinquency cases, but also should reduce the utilization of more intensive services like residential programming and SYSC. The other big piece of this is to look at the rules of probation. They haven't really been updated in about 20 years. This is not a statutory thing, so that's where I put the plus up there, SB 94 plus. That's not really a legislative thing, but rather it's a court rule. And looking at those rules in a way that we can think about how do we get from a place where we have a cookie cutter approach, which we currently do in our probation rules, that every youth follows the same 20 rules, to where we actually look at the needs of youth and identify what those needs are and tailor the rules to what the focus of their case plan is. I'm really excited about this. We do not anticipate needing additional staff for this. What we're kind of counting on is the idea that if we are able to slowly implement, which Senate Bill 14 is designed to do, this process, we can get some staff doing these assessments on the front end, reducing the back end delinquency caseload, and basically use the existing workforce just in a different way to help reduce these caseloads over time. So that's something I'm really excited about. I wanted to share here.
So can I throw a thought at you?
Sure.
What would be nice for future budgeting drills is to be able to describe what the manpower and support structure would look like to create this new way of working with our juvenile cases, and be able to articulate, what the workload metrics are that drive the manpower analysis, and then how you're going to measure effectiveness and quality.
Mhm.
And it's probably way early for you to have any of that, but
Yeah, we're still,
I think anytime we introduce a new program like this,
Mhm.
we all want it to be a huge success and want to buy into the vision, but we also need to come back and just do the math.
Mhm. Yep, understood. And yeah, we are still in the development phase on this, but yes. So now we're moving into SYSC, and I don't know whether you want me to continue. You wanted to go till noon, so I can go through this now.
How many slides? Well, this is a huge topic.
Mhm.
But breaking before noon, I don't think helps the person that needed to leave at noon. So let's go ahead and get started.
Sure. So Sununu Youth Services Center, the last area that was planning on talking about around DCYF. Services at SYC include, creation of treatment plans, clinical and psychiatric assessments, educational and vocational planning and services, medical, dental, and nutritional services, family engagement, safety, community reentry work, recreational and experiential opportunities for youth, and then reunification and permanency planning for youth. Essentially, SYSC is, as I said before, the only facility in the state for detained and committed youth, and the services that have to go into that are pretty robust and comprehensive.
So, Mr. Ripson, I'm gonna cheat a little bit and kind of just tell you, you and I were trying to talk before the session really got busy, and I'll just frame this now to kind of give you a sense of where I think a few of us are at, and that is that the Sununu Youth Center was built in a time with a different vision, built with a different capacity and role in mind. And since then, the population has dwindled to small numbers, 10, 12, maybe 15, I don't know, small numbers. But because of the overhead associated with having to provide services in a broad way, it's become unbearably expensive on a per resident basis. And I hate to just jump to the kind of almost the conclusion, but where I think we would probably get the most bang for our buck in talking to you is if you just spoke more directly to the idea of what you think needs to happen to fundamentally transform the role and purpose of the Sununu Center and how that's reflected in the governor's budget request. And maybe those are two different things. Maybe the governor's budget request didn't anticipate radical transformation, but that would just be great to have, I think, that conversation here instead of maybe the kind of the prepared, this is the way things are story.
Sure. Maybe I can give just a little bit of a view at some of the data, because I think it informs that conversation, but I think that's the right conversation to have. So as you were saying, right, this data shows what the census of the facility is for the past few years and what we've seen. The dark line at the bottom is the average daily population for that state fiscal year. Last state fiscal year, the average daily population was 16.9. I haven't checked today. Yesterday, we had 13 youth in the facility, but there's some data that I'll show you in a minute that those numbers change pretty drastically on a daily basis. This also shows the number of total youth, committed youth. You do see 78 total youth throughout that period, but 108 commitments or admissions rather, which speaks to kind of the revolving door that we unfortunately do see at SYSC sometimes, of youth being discharged and then coming right back into the facility. This is the daily census across that period. And the reason I wanted to share this is that the average daily census can be a little bit misleading. Sometimes I see folks cherry pick a certain date and say, oh, there's only 8 kids there. Those numbers do change pretty dramatically. Certainly nowhere near the 144 that it was built for. But last July we were up into the high 20s. I think we've kind of stabilized into what typically is more in this 15 or lower range. You do have dates that it gets down even lower, but then it can very rapidly jump back up, which all present some challenges around trying to operationalize and staff. Now getting to a couple other points I just want to make. Sorry, one of the things that we've seen with the shifts at SYSC is kind of what I would call an increase in acuity of the youth who are there. So I think the changes that were made around admissions to SYSC has led to far fewer youth, but the youth that get there are youth that have more challenges. And you can see that play out in some of this, right? The average number of petitions, that's delinquency petitions for a youth in state fiscal year 16 was about, a little less than 10. Today, it's a little closer to 15 average petitions per youth. On the committed population, the detained population, relatively, stable. We did see some growth there from about 8 to about 11, not quite as drastic as you see in the committed population. Sorry, went too far. So I think to get to the points that you're making, though, there's a couple things. I think reducing the census at SYSC hasn't done as much to reduce the cost of the facility that people would have thought that it would. And there's a couple reasons for that. And it's not, I don't think, as much based on the overhead of the facility that is part of the contributing factor. It's much more based on the needs of programming for that facility. When we made these changes of the number of youth, essentially we've reduced the economies of scale to such a point that the individual youth there still require really high levels of care, even though there are fewer of them. And it gets really complex. And some of this, it's unfortunate we're having this meeting before the next joint fiscal meeting. The legislative budget assistant is putting out an audit of SYSC, which starts to talk through some of this stuff from somebody other than myself. So it would be helpful for you all to have that, but in a few weeks you will. But part of what we see there that's really challenging is a lot of the youth have different programming needs and have to be kind of set on separate units and things like that. That requires additional staffing. So, for example, if we have a female in the facility, which we often do, often it's just one, sometimes it's 2 or 3, that female requires a separate unit, that unit requires separate staffing. We generally maintain 2 male units. We really can't get less than 2 male units, regardless of how many youth are in the building, because it's very common that the males in the facility have a court order that they have to be kept separately because they either have some challenges outside with each other, what some folks might say is gang involvement, rival gang involvement, or some other type of, maybe they were involved in a common act of delinquency, and the prosecutors and the court order that they be kept separate while they're within the facility. That requires additional staffing. During the period of COVID, we've had to maintain quarantine and isolation units, which require additional staffing. It's not uncommon to have a youth who's sick, has to be in the infirmary. We need staffing with them 24/7. Lots of the youth that we're serving today have really intense needs and require one-to-one support. So all of that has added up to a situation that when you had 50 kids there, it kind of came out in the wash. But now that the majority of kids there have these unique needs that require additional support, the cost per child increases. The other things that I think are really substantial there is the programming, right? We offer a full service school there, which I think is imperative for these youth. Many of the youth who go there catch up on their education and are able to return back to school with more credits than they had ever had to get towards graduation. But operating a full-scale school for 15 youth is much less efficient than operating a full-scale school for 60 youth. The education program has been cut back in recent years, but without compromising the subject matter that's taught, it's hard to cut it back much further. Nursing that's available 24/7 within the facility. When you're talking about serving 60 youth, that cost doesn't seem so high, but when you're talking about serving 10 to 15, those costs add up. I think all this is to say that the real cost of SYSC is the staffing cost, and staffing costs that would continue even in a smaller building. So I think where that leaves us is in a place where the state needs to make a couple decisions. Should there be a secured facility in the state? I think it's hard to say that you would have 0 options for a secured facility for youth in the state of New Hampshire. We've had multiple kids who have killed people since I've been in this state. I'm not sure what we would do with those kids in a situation like that. Kids who have committed some other really horrific crimes that I don't know what we would do with those kids if we did not have a facility. So if that's the decision that's made that we need a different facility, then I think the question is to think about when do we decide what that facility is. Certainly we can make that decision now about how to move into a new facility. I do think that there are so many things happening external to the facility that the data today is not accurate as to what the future need is going to be. And we would run the risk of building something bigger than what the future need is. If I was to be asked today how big a facility to build based on the current data, I'd look at the last year and say at our peak, we needed 27 beds. So we need to build to our peak. But in a couple of years, as the system of care is rolled out, as the JJ transformation work occurs, as the new services are put online, like multi-systemic therapy that we're going to talk about in a minute, we might find that that number is way too high. And then we once again build a facility that's too big for our needs. So I think it's clear that the state needs to think about what is next in terms of a secured facility. I think the question of what that facility should be, how large that facility should be, and when is the right time to make that decision based on the data is, in my opinion, still an open question.
Thank you for that wonderful summary. We have just a few minutes, and there are 3 reps with their hands up, and so I'm gonna propose to the committee members with their hands up. If you think the answer may be a long, involved one, would you just simply state the question and we'll get the answer after lunch. That way, Mr. Ripson can think about the answer a little bit. If it's a short data question, we can just close it out right here. But if it's going to take much time, let's postpone it so that we can break for lunch on time. So Representative Weiler, you had your hand up first, I believe, followed by Representative Nordgren and then Wallner.
Mr. Chair, I have one with short answer. Difference between committed and detained.
Committed youth they have gone through the process, and the court has found true that they have committed the act. It might be through a trial or it might be through a plea agreement, but the court has found true that whatever act they're alleged to have committed had indeed occurred. Detained is when a youth is immediately picked up after some type of event, and they're put there oftentimes short-term pending court decision about whether to keep them in detention or whether to return them to the community pending further court activity.
And the question to think of a little longer, if we could get economies of scale, and we can't get economies of scale, either we would send these youth out of state to someplace else, even if it were a couple $100,000 per youth, it would still be cheaper than what we're spending, or we bring some in from other states so we have a little more economy of scale. That's the long question. We'll talk to that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Weiler, for framing it that way. Representative Nordgren?
Yes, thank you. Representative Weiler brought up part of my question is how many children do we have out of state now? I know we've sometimes had them in Vermont. We've had them way over in Ohio. So maybe you could just give us a little background on that when you have a chance.
Sure. I mean, that could be a quick one. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but last time I looked, it was about 70 kids across all of DCYF who were placed out of state somewhere. A lot of those kids are right over the border though. The number of kids that are far away is typically somewhere around 10 or so. I can try to circle back during the break and get exact numbers as of today.
Thank you.
Representative Wallner?
My question is sort of the opposite of theirs. How many children do we have in these numbers who are from out of state, if any?
Yeah, right now there are no out-of-state kids or there's no Vermont kids. There were a couple, I have to double back. There were a couple kids from another state who committed an act in New Hampshire who were at SYSC, and I'm not sure if they're still there. So I'm gonna have to double check on those, but there are, I think part of your question is around the Vermont contract, and right now there are no kids placed based on acts that have occurred out of state.
Okay, thank you. And my other question, this one might be a little bit longer. When children come into the facility, or into the juvenile justice system, are you doing an assessment to be sure that they are in the appropriate setting? And I would particularly was thinking about the girls, and you were saying that you have to have a whole unit set aside for the girls. And I think in previous years, we have talked about trying to contract with existing other programs to take to have the girls in other programs and not at the Sununu Center, which would mean that you would have one unit that you wouldn't have to run. Have we looked at that kind of stuff?
Yeah, there is.
Let's defer the answer, and then you can think about
Okay.
it. All right.
Thank you.
And that brings us to 11:55. Are there any other questions to be raised before lunch break? I'm not seeing any. So I want to put us into recess until 12:45.
Thank you,
Mr.
Chair.
Ripple, if you could turn off the mic
Yes.
out, that'd be great. Finish at 3:15. So if we quit interrupting you and you just said what you wanted to say, how long do you need?
My presentation is only a handful of additional slides, probably 30 minutes, but then there's the budget stuff that Karen will take the lead on, and I'm not sure how to calculate that.
We're gonna be shut down by 3:15. Okay, so we're now out of recess. Are we recording?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So Division 3 Finance has come back from its recess for lunch. Before lunch, Mr. Ripson was asked some questions. He's had a little bit of time to think about them. I'm going to turn the floor over to him to have his dialogue.
Great, thank you again. For the record, Joe Ripson, Director DCYF, in my office alone in Concord. I'll take one of the easier questions first. It's just some data. Representative Nordgren asked for the specific number of youth who are currently out of state. There are currently 74 youth placed out of state. Of those, 67 are in neighboring states and 7 are further away.
Do you have a follow-up, Representative Nordgren, now that you know the data?
Yeah, could you, thank you. Could you clarify that number of 70?
It's 74 total out of state. 70 was my guess earlier, but the actual number is 74 out of state. Of those, 67 are in our neighboring states, which, we have a lot of kids right over the border in Vermont and Massachusetts and Maine, and 7 are placed further away than our neighboring states.
Right, thank you.
All right.
Great.
Way to start.
And then we had a question. Regarding, whether an option is to think about sending kids out of New Hampshire who are at SYSC or bringing youth into New Hampshire into SYSC. I think those are things that could be explored. I think there would be a significant challenge around sending kids out for a couple reasons. One, personally, programmatically, I'm not thrilled with the facilities in our neighboring states. I'm much more comfortable with SYSC. I'm sorry, my phone just started talking to me. Second, for purposes of detention, which tends to be an immediate need and an immediate placement need, traveling out of state could pose a significant challenge and hardship to law enforcement and folks. The alternative of serving kids within SYSC from other states, we haven't really robustly explored that. As I alluded to earlier in response to one of Representative Wollner's questions, we do currently have a contract with Vermont to serve some of their kids. Vermont had closed their sole secured facility last year without a new plan in place, and had found themselves in a situation where they didn't have places to put kids, and asked to contract with us while they are currently in the process of building a private facility for commitment and detention. So Vermont is building their own facility. As of now, we do have a contract with them, but we do not have any Vermont kids placed with us at this moment. We haven't talked to other states as to whether there'd be an interest in something like that. So I'm not sure whether there would be, but certainly that's something that could be considered. No follow-up to that. I'll move on to the last question, which was Representative Wellner.
Wait, I think there may be a follow-up, or at least a related question. Representative Rogers?
It's not a related question. It's a new question, though, when he finishes, if that's all right.
Okay.
I guess, okay.
Go ahead and start.
My question is about the recidivism rate in the facility when we're talking about the other things that you mentioned earlier. I'm just curious, I've heard the recidivism rate is as high as 60%. And I just wondered if you confirm, you talked about that you're concerned about moving them because of the programs there. And my concern is if the recidivism rate is in fact that high, is the recidivism rate, is the programs actually that great?
Yeah, so, and I think, so this is actually an issue that gets delved into pretty robustly in the audit, which will be available to folks in a couple of weeks. Off the top of my head, I'm not remembering what the current recidivism rate is, but it's certainly high, and it's higher than it was in recent years. And part of that, there's a couple drivers to that. One is that we've really concentrated the population of youth who are entering to only be youth who are really more acute in their needs. So that would obviously impact the recidivism rate. The other, which I think has been problematic, is that the changes in House Bill 517 that changed the way that parole thinks about discharge really removed from their consideration treatment needs and whether the youth are able to have their needs met in the community, or whether they're in the midst of treatment at the facility that would be best continued, and rather is really limited to an assessment of the length of time that they've been there and whether they pose an immediate danger to themselves or others. That I think has led to some real programmatic challenges around being able to complete courses of treatment with youth. And one of the things that you'll see in the forthcoming audit is a recommendation that evidence-based modalities be used with these youth, which certainly would be hard if you're trying to do it out of the context of a place where people could consider the continuation of treatment needs, because most of those evidence-based models require certain dosage in order to be practiced with fidelity. So I do think those are both contributing factors to what has been a growing recidivism. From what I've seen, I don't think that our youth would get better care at any of the other facilities. What I think is also unique about New Hampshire is the way that we limit the amount of time that youth stay there is completely different than how any other state operates. So it would be another challenge around what would happen in those programs. I fear that if we put youth into some programs out of state, detention facilities out of state, commitment facilities out of state, their programming wouldn't at all align to our what's typically a 3-month or 6-month length of stay based on the severity of the underlying incident. And they actually would not receive the type of treatment that they need as a result of that.
Did you have a follow-up? Because if you don't, I do. So a 60% recidivism rate seems pretty high. I don't know your stats, but how does that feel based on what you know nationally?
I am sure that our recidivism rate is quite high. I've just, again, off the top of my head, I don't have that data handy, but I do know it's cited specifically in the audit report. I think our recidivism, I don't know how it compares nationally, but it's definitely high. So
in this community, which is, I'm sure, a subspecialty of DCYF people around the nation, is there sort of like as one state that just seems to have come up with a different approach that everyone is going, oh, that's the right way to handle these kids? Is there a luminary?
Yeah, there's a couple jurisdictions that do this work quite well. I think actually the plans that we have in place are on that path and actually are on the path of getting us beyond where.
I bet this is his tires.
Representative Weiler, oh, there you go. Go ahead.
Thank you. The part of what you have to think about is the number of youth that are placed in this setting right now, which comparatively nationally is very, very low compared to the number of youth in the state as a whole, right? We have on average 17 at a given time. And that's between detained and committed. Most states have far more per capita youth in their secured facilities around the country. The states that I've seen that do this work quite well, New Jersey was one of them, and New Jersey relied largely on a robust behavioral health system for kids with really specialized residential programs to meet those kids' needs, to get them the services they need, the treatment they need, to get them back into the community. That didn't eliminate the need for detention and commitment, but it drove down the numbers of detention and commitment drastically. And it meant that when kids were discharged from a detention or commitment placement, that they had a place to go which was able to meet their needs. That's really lacking today in New Hampshire, although the work that's currently underway should remedy that. When I talk about the work that's currently underway, I'm largely talking about the work that's happening within children's behavioral health to completely redesign our residential care system, to have basically different tiers based on clinical needs, different requirements of providers that they've never had to face before, inclusive of becoming accredited programs, introducing trauma-informed models of care, introducing something called 6 core strategies to eliminate or reduce the use of restraint and seclusion, and including, and this taps into one of the questions that Representative Wallner just asked around the use of assessment, including the use of a comprehensive needs and psychosocial assessment to determine what level of care kids actually need. I found it shocking when I got to the state that we actually don't do that when we make placement decisions. We make placement decisions.
I want to pause you there. Representative Nordgren and Wallner and Weiler, they all have questions for you, but you've sort of you've kind of diverged from my question, which I think may have just simply been New Jersey. What state is
I think another state that people speak highly of, which had a comparable model, is Missouri. Missouri's actually backslid a little bit in recent years, but they were a state that was doing something similar, though not identical to what we were doing in New Jersey in terms of building out increased clinical capacity to meet the needs of these kids, and then being able to rely less on things like detention and commitment.
And then the other thing that you were talking about, I think, transforming the way we provide juvenile justice services. My first question of the day, I think, was around, do you have transformation plans ready to go, and does the governor's budget support the transformation? And so I'm getting a mixed message, because initially it didn't sound like you had transformation plans, and now it sort of sounds like maybe you do. So why am I confused?
So when you ask so there are transformative plans underway in terms of how juvenile justice as a whole works, in terms of how clinical services for kids are offered. Both of those things are going to be hugely impactful on the number of kids that enter residential care and the number of kids that end up requiring a stay in a detainment or commitment setting. What I don't have transformational plans is a redesign of what SYSC should be. So those are distinct questions in my mind, but they are overlapping significantly, because the resolution of those other issues around children's behavioral health and how kids enter the juvenile justice system is going to have an impact on the utilization of SYSC and other residential programs.
Thank you for clarifying that. We'll go with Representative Nordgren, then Weiler, then Wallner. I think that was the order.
Thank you very much. Joe, could you please dig down into that number of 74 children who are out of state? With such a low population at Sununu, it'd be interesting to know if some of those kids come back. I think we don't need that information right now, but if you could just give us some sense of why those children are not here, and if there are any who could be back in Sununu.
Yeah, so those are actually, the kids that are out of state are not out of state for the purpose of detention or commitment, which is the sole legal purpose of SYSC. SYSC is not allowed to be used for a residential placement. It's only allowed to be used for kids who have been adjudicated or ordered by the court, or who are in a detention status pending that. The kids who are placed out of state would not be eligible for SYSC. What those kids largely are youth who potentially could be served by in-state residential providers, but a lack of capacity or a lack of clinical expertise to meet those needs has pushed those kids out of state. I would say some of those providers, the bordering state providers, are literally right on the border and are probably providers that would even remain part of the picture in the future state. For example, there's a lot of kids based in settings that are right along the Vermont-New Hampshire border that are used by both Vermont and New Hampshire. I don't think that those are things that are necessarily going to change in the future state in terms of who those providers are, but what will change is what our expectations are of those providers in terms of the care they provide to kids.
Okay, thank
Do you have a
you.
follow-up?
No, I just think I'd like more information on the differences maybe of who's aware and why they're aware. Okay, thanks.
Do you want that information, Representative Nordgren, in this budget cycle, or is there more time?
Well, I think it would be informational to know if there are other categories we could be funding different ways.
So you want an answer sooner rather than later?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I would add to that, right, the work that's underway, folks could take a look. There is an RFP posted right now. I have to be careful not to speak too much because it's a live RFP, but there is an RFP right now to fundamentally transform residential care in this state. For the first time ever requiring all those things I've provided before, and also for the first time ever actually requiring contracts for providers, which, believe it or not, we did not require before, and made it really difficult to monitor outcomes and to really set expectations. So I think what the hope is, the plan is that through that procurement process, we will develop the in-state capacity to bring most of these kids, certainly the ones far away, home. But there may still be some kids and programs that are on the border, but we would be contracting with those programs on the border and being able to hold them accountable the same way that New Hampshire programs would be held accountable.
Thank you. Representative Weiler?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, speaking of recidivism, you said 60% recidivism. I think we close to what we see from the prison, about 50%. So I'm wondering, your graduates go on to go to the prison and likely is part of the reason that it's only 60% is some of them age out. And what percentage end up in prison anyway?
And unfortunately, our data doesn't connect with the data at DOC, so I can't answer that question. But what I can say is anecdotally, we do unfortunately see young people move on from the juvenile justice system, particularly from SYSC into the adult system. And that's exactly why this system of care work, I think, is really so critical, because I don't think that we're meeting the needs of these young people the way that the system is currently designed. And as we redesign residential programs I was talking about, and put in those other system of care components that we've spoken about, we'll see those numbers change. Speaking about the experience in other states around this, I certainly don't have the data to draw a causal relationship. But as the system of care in New Jersey grew, the need for adult corrections in New Jersey shrank at a time that the need for adult corrections in New Hampshire was growing. So I do believe that the work that we do with young people to meet their needs and set them up to be productive adults helps downstream effects, even in terms of who ends up in our correctional system in the future.
I'm as hopeful as you that is the result. Thank you.
So Representative Wallner, then Erf, then Rogers.
So, Mr. Representative, I hope that this afternoon during some of our discussion, and it might be during the budget part, but that you talk to us a little bit about Medicaid reimbursement. I know that we do not get any sort of reimbursement from the federal government at the Sununu Center at this time. And my understanding is that's because it is a quote corrections facility. If many of these children could be moved out into community residential programs that are therapeutic, reimbursement would be available. A 50% reimbursement would be available from the feds through Medicaid. Am I correct in my assumptions here?
Yeah, it is correct, right? When there's a correctional setting, Medicaid is not allowed to support that cost, that placement cost. So it ends up being overwhelmingly general funds, although SYSC's budget does include some like DOE education funds for the education program, but overwhelmingly it's general funds. And yes, community programs typically can receive Medicaid. I think what's from a budgetary perspective, what gets difficult is you exacerbate, and it's not a reason not to do it because kids should be in the least restrictive environment that they can be in. But you do continue to exacerbate that economies of scale issue that we were talking about before, where the savings yielded may not actually be as much as folks anticipate they will be. But I do think that maximizing Medicaid revenue and getting kids in least restrictive environments where clinically appropriate is always the best thing to do.
Thank you.
You have a follow-up?
No,
Okay, your
I'm
hand's
fine.
up. FYI. Representative Irf?
Two quick questions. Can we get a copy of that RFP?
Yes, it's posted on our website right now. We can forward that.
That's fine. Just send me the link.
Sure.
And second question is, can we get a written definition of system of care? I hear that term a lot in different contexts.
Yes. Yes, I'll talk to our behavioral health folks about trying to get a written definition for it. But essentially, it's the concept of how you provide behavioral health services to, in this instance, children throughout the state.
Thanks.
Follow up, are you done? Okay, Representative Rogers?
Yes, Mr. Ribson, if we were to place language in House Bill 2 to call for the closing of the Sununu Center and for construction of a smaller detainee center or smaller secured unit and options, are you prepared to come back to us with your thoughts on what this would take, how long it would take, what you would want, and what kind of transformational, in your language, kind of information you would have as a plan? I think that many of us here are looking at that when we look at it. Some of us have been looking at it for the past 10 to 15 years, actually. But it's something that a number of people are talking about and looking at this point. Can you be prepared to come back to us with some of your thoughts on this? Or I don't know if you already have thoughts, but a plan.
I can certainly share thoughts. I think that decision is obviously not just mine, so I'd want to include other people in that conversation. But I think one of the real challenges around downsizing it, and I think it is ultimately the right thing to do, is that, in my opinion, we want the programming in the new facility to be comparable to the programming that exists today, which means that it's not going to be, it might not be all that much less expensive. And that the amenities that are available to youth in SYSC should be available to youth in the future state as well. Could be smaller bunking areas, but SYSC offers youth comprehensive internal and indoor and outdoor recreational space through an indoor gymnasium and outdoor courtyards, basketball courts, and all of that. It offers youth, a full school, a library, a full medical suite where we're able to meet the needs of youth, dental suite where a dentist comes in and is able to meet the kids' dental needs. Unfortunately, a lot of the young people who get placed there haven't had dental needs cared for in years before getting there. And we do a lot of rehabilitative work in that space. And that the clinical programming is comprehensive and probably even more so than it is today. We recently hired a full-time psychologist down there to redesign our clinical programming, and I'm thrilled with the work that she's doing. Unfortunately, she joined after COVID started, and a lot of our priorities had to shift during the last 9 months just to keep people, safe in the context of COVID. But I'm thrilled with the work that she's doing in redeveloping our clinical programming. So I think, if I was to be asked what the next facility should look like, it really should have the same amenities that the current one does, but probably would have to be smaller scale to align with what the census is. I think that also gets complex for the reasons I spoke about before, and that if I was asked today how big of a facility to build, I would be looking at the last fiscal year and looking at our highest day and say we should build to that because we need to be able to meet the peak, which would be about 27. But I also believe that the system of care work that we've been talking about is going to drive down the number over the future years. And if you were asking me this question in 2 years, it'd probably be a much lower number than that. So I think we're at this point right now where, at least for me, there's a recognition that there needs to be a next step. But for me, also, the data is a little unclear as to what that next step should be.
If I could follow up.
Yes, ma'am.
We just have a number of studies over the last 15 years, I think, that have all come to the same conclusion that we need to close that facility and do something different. And we've never taken that next step. I think maybe this year is the time to take the next step. And I guess that's what I'm asking you, is to come back to us and tell us, instead of waiting 2 years, which is what we always hear, let's wait another year, let's wait another year, let's wait another year. And it's now 15 years later. And we're spending 12.5 million on a facility for that was built for hundreds and now has, you say, maybe 26, sometimes as low as 8. I think we need to take the next step now instead of waiting for another 2 years. So I guess I'm asking you, what would you, instead of us coming up with something you don't like, maybe having you come up to tell us what that next step is instead of waiting 2 years.
Yep.
I'm sick of waiting 2 years.
Yeah,
Thank
I would
you.
say, and I appreciate the question and I appreciate the sentiment. I would say, to be fair, the system of care work should have preceded any of this conversation. That should have been happening a decade ago. And the fact that it hadn't puts us at a disadvantage for making the decisions that we need to make today. So, I think a decision could be made to move forward with this more expeditiously. And if so, I'd say you need to build to the cap, which is 27. But in 2 years, the data will probably look different and will probably look more favorable and would yield us building a facility that's more aligned with what the actual demand is going to be in the future, as opposed to what the demand was last fiscal year.
And I thank you for your bluntness, and I'm sorry to be impatient, but it's been a long time.
So I want to follow up on one of the implications there. And I was just kind of brainstorming with somebody the other day. Are you familiar with the Federal Base Realignment and Closure Commission? Okay, so in the 70s, we had a real big problem in the Department of Defense. We had military installations all over the nation, and every single installation was feeding money into a small town somewhere, and became a huge part of the business and tax revenues of these localities. And so when it came time to start looking at reducing the number of bases that we had around the country, it was all political fighting. There weren't any solutions. So they set up this independent base realignment and closure commission to kind of get out of the local politics and get an independent group to set up recommendations. And their recommendations would be take all of it or none of it. There wasn't any splitting the baby. It was just take all of it or none of it. And I just wonder if what your thoughts are we at a point where we maybe need to realize that we need something like a base realignment and closure commission to take a look at establishing a sure path to doing what we know we need to do, which is to realign the Sununu Center? So that's a very leading and hard question, and I'm sorry for that.
No, I mean, I think it is absolutely time to take a hard look at that. I do think, as I said before, the data is going to change in the next couple of years based on the work that's currently happening. So it's hard to make a decision today. To Representative Rogers' point before, right, there have been multiple study commissions over the years that have not really yielded a comprehensive answer to this question. So one of the things I would be concerned about is repeating something like that to not actually yield a result. But I do think it's time to figure out, what that is, and so something like that could be worthwhile. I guess I just wanted to make sure that it's productive.
Okay, so we have 19 days to finish our Division 3 work, and I would like to know if we should be doing anything different with year 2 of this budget to either anticipate a realignment or to drive a realignment plan. So if you could maybe think through it a little bit and try to give us sort of your best projection of what we should be thinking about for FY23. that would be great. And if that's not enough time to coordinate with the governor's office, let us know and tell us what you need.
Okay.
Please. Okay. All right. So I don't see any questions. Did you answer all the pre-lunch questions?
I had one more that I touched on a little bit, but didn't answer comprehensively from Representative Wallner about the assessments for youth entering residential care. That is something that was recently procured. I can't go into detail about it because it's not yet in final phase with Governor and Council, but I can talk about the concept, which is that under Senate Bill 14 and under this newly procured system, all youth who are going to enter residential care will have a comprehensive clinical assessment, which will include something called the CANS, the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths Tool, as well as a psychosocial, which can advise as to whether the child clinically requires residential care, and if they do, what level of residential care they do require. For youth who are placed emergently, that's going to happen after the emergent placement. But the idea is that in most instances, that can be done before a placement is made, while you try to temporarily stabilize the youth in the community before making that decision. That will impact SYSC. The other key component of the system of care that's impactful here is the use of a care management entity. Right now there are two, NFI, and I can't remember the name of the other one that used to be called Monadnock. But what they do is they use a high fidelity wraparound model to pull together the folks who are important in that youth's life to oversee what's happening, not only while the residential episode is occurring, that includes SYSC in this future state, but also more importantly, to support the discharge planning and to ensure that when youth return home, that they have the care that they need to remain at home and not recidivate back into the residential system or SYSC. Those key components are identical to the models that we used in New Jersey, which were successful in driving down the utilization of congregate care and recidivism within those programs. So those are components I'm really excited about. I think they will be impactful both on the broader residential system, but also on SYSC, because both of them will be used across the spectrum, inclusive of SYSC. And I think that was all the questions I received before, but if I missed any, please remind me.
Representative Wallner, do you have a question?
I do. When you do, the assessment is done on children who are detained as well as those that have already been adjudicated?
Yeah, and it's actually broader than that. So the idea is that we want to understand the clinical needs of youth when they're entering these restrictive settings, regardless of where they appear within the system, right? So it could be juvenile justice that are going to residential care without a detention or commitment. It could be youth who are being detained committed. It could be youth in the child protection system. It could even be youth who don't touch either of those systems and through children's behavioral health are accessing that care. But the idea is that, frankly, these kids, no matter where they're appearing within the system, have comparable challenges. And we need to have a uniform way to understand those challenges and to meet their needs. One of the really beautiful things about using a tool like the CANS, which we actually have future plans of using in other aspects of the system, is it creates a common language amongst service providers to understand what needs are and how to develop treatment plans, and then continuity of care across different aspects of the system. The other really important thing about all of this is that housing it within children's behavioral health, rather than housing it with DCYF, child protection or juvenile justice, allows for child protection and juvenile justice to walk away when our delinquency issues or our abuse and neglect issues are resolved, but it allows that family to continue to get care through the children's behavioral health care system if that child still has a clinical need to be met. What we see a lot of today, and this is going to help drive down caseloads in DCYF, is kids that get stuck in our system because they have a service need, even though the underlying abuse and neglect issue is resolved or the underlying delinquency issue is resolved. So a lot of this is about trying to get kids and families in the most supportive setting, the least restrictive setting, the same way that we think about kids that enter residential settings being in the least restrictive setting.
Thank you.
Not seeing any more questions. If you want to get us back on the path with your slide set.
I'll pull up the screenshot. Give me 1 second. Oops, that's the wrong slide. Sorry about that. Where's the right one? Here it is. All right, so we touched on a lot of this, so I'm going to just go pretty quickly, but people may have questions. We've done a lot in the last 2 years. We've been incredibly busy. Thankful for the support that we've received in the past really 3 years since I've been here to do all of this work from the legislature, from both parties in the legislature, from the governor, from hosts of people interested in this work. So it was hard to fit all this onto a slide, but just really quickly, some of the key accomplishments. Restoring kind of core functionality of the child protection system and further progressing within that. We talked about the changes that are happening in intake and how we're seeing that play out in our data. Another key accomplishment was redesigning our actuarial tools that we use to assess risk and need in families, both at intake, but actually throughout the life of a child protection case. You use these actuarial tools to make key decisions. Those have been redesigned, validated. They need to be built into our new case management system, which is currently under development. Reducing caseloads, improving processes and timeliness for child protection assessments, and the safety culture work and the clinical support staff that we spoke about before, which appears to be helping reduce turnover. Other key things that are underway that I'm really excited about: a service array redesign to introduce evidence-based practices. This started on the date that the continuing resolution ended. We issued a request for information to the public to ask for information around how should we be redesigning the services that we offer to families. We received a record 40 responses to that. We then took that information, used that to make decisions about what type of evidence-based models we want to bring into our system, and to start phasing out some of the non-evidence-based practices that we've been using for decades. The first of those things are what we call community-based voluntary services. This was something that was funded in the last biennium and is funded, continued in the proposed budget. This is, I think, one of the most impactful things we're going to do on the child protection side of the house. And what it does is it will allow us to refer a high-risk family to a community provider, for that community provider to work with that family to try to stabilize them, to prevent them from coming back to DCYF. So let me pause on that because it's complex and it's really, really important to our system. I spoke a moment ago about the actuarial tools that we use. One of them is a risk assessment. When we conduct these risk assessments, about a third of our families come back as being high or very high risk, meaning that there's a high likelihood, according to that tool, that they're going to come back into the child protection system absent some intervention. However, when we make a finding of abuse or neglect, only about 10% of those families are actually found to have already committed an act of abuse or neglect. A finding of abuse or neglect is really a reactive way to respond to it, whereas assessing risk and trying to treat risk is a more proactive way to do it. So about 23% of the families we see in a given year are high risk, but historically we would not have been allowed to do anything for them, and we wouldn't have had a service for them. What this community-based voluntary services will do is we use that risk assessment. We identify these are the families that are high and very high risk. We refer those families to a provider. We contracted, it was approved by GNC in November with 2 providers, Waypoint for most of the state, and the Family Resource Center in Gorham for the North Country. Those providers then open up a case to work with those families using 2 evidence-based modalities, motivational interviewing and solution-based casework, to try to understand and address those families' needs, try to ensure that those families are stable and that we don't get another call back to DCYF. We get a lot of clients and families that come through our doors over and over again. This is a key way to break that cycle. And when I spoke earlier, Representative Edwards, about our ability to drive down the number of family crises that have kids coming into out-of-home care, this is one of the key tools to do that. Another key accomplishment, the link is here. I would suggest if folks
Can you take a breath? Can you take a breath there? As you were talking, I was thinking about any sort of control systems that would need to be put into place in advance to avoid fraud, waste, and abuse. So once you get a risk-based actuarial risk assessment, you document what questions and answers result to the most risk. And the more risk that you have, the more likely you are to get additional government benefits. And so just thinking like, somebody who might want to take advantage of the system, I might want to learn how to game this risk assessment so that my risk score goes way up. And so you start paying for my apartment.
I think that's highly unlikely for this service line. This is a service line where what you have offered to you is a social worker who's working with you on parenting skills, working with you on navigating, other systems. It's not to pay for your rent or to provide, some type of concrete service like that. This is a tool to try to understand families who are lacking the parental skills to keep kids safe at home, and then providing the services that help remedy those situations.
When you say services, I'm thinking at some point those services are considered valuable or beneficial to the recipient, and therefore it has an equivalent of a monetary value. And so therefore, thinking of gaming the system, why isn't there an incentive there to game the system unless the only service you think I'm going to get is additional counseling?
I don't think there is an incentive to game the system here. I don't think this type of service is the type that would attract that type of response from a client. I don't think someone is going to present as having issues of domestic violence and substance use when they don't, for the purpose of having an extra counselor in their house.
All right. No, you answered my question, because I every time you hear services, I hear services. I'm just wondering exactly what the nature of those services are and whether they would be worth lying on an assessment to get them.
Understand. Thank you.
So, all right.
I put a link here for this. I think this is something worth looking at. This is we put forward a procurement forecast on a host of evidence-based programs that we intend to procure within the next year. One of them is currently out for bid, called multi-systemic therapy. There's a few more on that list. I do think anybody that's interested would benefit from taking a look at that. But basically what we're doing is we're shifting from a model that we currently have in the state, which is that we kind of have a one-size-fits-all approach to clinical services to our families, recognizing that those services are not evidence-based. There's not evidence to show that they actually work, and that there are models out there that are evidence-based and actually are proven to work. So that funding forecast lists forward 5 different models that we're looking to expand into the next year. This is going to be largely replacing the other services that are offered to families. So there is funding in the governor's budget, proposed budget, to cover those costs, but it's not like we're building a new service that's going to be added on top of the old service. It's a new service that's going to be offered instead of the old service. So it's not a fully new program or new funding program in that way. Other major accomplishments. We did expand foster care for youth who choose to remain in foster care up to age 21 in the last biennium. That our youth named that program the HOPE program, as is identified in here. This allows young people who would otherwise age out of care at age 18 to stay in foster care up to 21 if they choose to, recognizing that a lot of young people who enter the foster care system and would age out are not ready for full independence into adulthood without some additional support in place. We implemented another evidence-based model called YV LifeSet. YV stands for Youth Villages, which is the entity that developed the model. This is a model for transition-aged youth to try to help them successfully move to adulthood, work with them on whatever their identified goals are, and then attaining those goals so they can be independent into adulthood. We were awarded a grant to pay for half of the cost of that program, and the other half of the cost is contracted with the vendor. And then lastly, in this area, we've been very successful in the past couple of years. In the first time for New Hampshire, although this is not new nationally, being able to partner with housing authorities to get access to housing vouchers for young people who are aging out of foster care, trying to positively impact the prevalence of youth homelessness, particularly for kids who are part of the foster care system. Beyond that, some other programming that we're very excited about. In the past few years, we started up something called the Strength to Succeed program. This is peer support for parents with substance use disorder. This has been incredibly successful. We have, what this does is it connects a parent who has a substance use disorder with another parent who has successfully gone through that challenge, and many of whom have successfully come through the child protection system. And we really find it helpful in getting those parents the care and support that they need so that they can actually successfully reunify with their kids instead of their kids having to be having their rights terminated and having those young people end up in needing adoption or long-term foster care. The MLADAC and family violence specialist programs have been expanded over the past couple of years. The MLADAC program, master's license alcohol and drug counselor program, those are MLADACs who are in normal times physically co-located with our staff, but right now virtually co-located with our staff to assist our staff in identifying when families have substance use challenges and connecting those families to the right supports and services to address those substance use challenges. And the family violence specialists, which are co-located in our district offices, those are folks who work with the local crisis centers and help our staff in understanding the dynamics of family violence and connecting victims of family violence to those crisis center services to try to stabilize those families so we're able to keep those kids from having to come into foster care. Roadmap to Reunification is an exciting new program. We phased out an old program that we called FAIR and replaced it with this. This is a model where we have a clinical person who is working with foster parents and birth parents around trying to help parents successfully reunify. It's really important when kids enter foster care that we recognize that those foster parents could actually be more than just a temporary home for a child, but actually can be a support to the birth parent in making sure that the child can successfully reunify back into the home. And a lot of our foster parents are eager to do this work, but this extra support helps bridge those gaps and really helps our parents get ready for this this tough work of trying to heal their families and bring their families back together again. Really excited about some of the partnerships we developed in the past couple of years with the housing authorities around what's called family unification housing vouchers. These are federal housing vouchers available to families who are at risk of having their kids enter foster care or who are unable to reunify because of housing instability. So these are federal vouchers that are specifically provided for the purpose of addressing those issues with our families, which might lead kids to enter care.
So I have to stop you there. So
Sure.
you just said there was housing instability potential and therefore grants that I presume are intended to make the housing stable, which sounds like depending on the evaluation of a family, they may end up getting some of their rent paid.
Yes, this is an entirely different program than the program we were talking about before. This is for what's called a family unification program, a family unification voucher program. These are HUD vouchers that are available for this purpose. And we partnered with the housing authorities to apply for these HUD vouchers to be able to provide families who are at risk of entering foster care as a result of housing instability, or families who cannot reunify because the parents do not have housing adequate to serve their kids.
And I'll let you go, but I just want to believe that there are internal controls in place to anticipate the potential for fraud, waste, and abuse, and that there's active measures in place to make sure that these benefits aren't abused.
Yes, and these are HUD vouchers. There's a host of requirements that come in place with all of that. In addition to the requirements around our deeming eligibility based on their children, either at risk of entering care or unable to reunify as a result of care. But the underlying criteria in terms of who qualifies for a voucher are the same as the other federally funded housing voucher programs.
Thank you.
We spoke a lot about this, so I won't talk a whole lot, but the partnership with our children's behavioral health system around the system of care transformation has been huge. And also partnerships with public health and our Division of Employment and Housing Security to expand support to strengthen families to try to prevent DCYF involvement through their work with family resource centers and the new kinship navigator programs, which I'm very excited about. So unless there's questions, I'll move on.
I don't see any.
So key challenges ahead. I do mention here housing instability is something that keeps coming up within our cases as a challenge for our families. I think you hear about this in some of the other presentations as well, but work that can be done to to address this issue broadly is going to have a positive impact on families involved with child protection. We spoke about this earlier too, so I won't belabor it, but recruitment and retention of staff. I do think that we've made some great progress. I think we have a great plan, but we still are seeing a turnover that I'm not satisfied with, and it remains a continuing challenge. And then lastly, family strengthening programs for families prior to DCYF involvement. I spoke earlier about the changes we made at intake to refer more families to family resource centers and other resources in the community. That has a great effect of keeping these families from getting into DCYF. But what we're finding, unfortunately, is that some of those programs aren't ready to handle the flow of families that we're sending them. They don't have the supports that they need to handle the increased volume of referrals that they're getting from us. So I think that's another challenge that would be useful to think about moving forward. Identity and tenure of the key division leaders. Myself, I've been here for 3.5 years. Many of you know Rebecca Ross, who's our General Counsel and Legislative Liaison. She's been here for 2.5 years. Sherry Ermel's our Bureau Chief of Field Services. That is, all of the Child Protection and Juvenile Justice Field Services. She's been with us for 1.5 years in that role, but 21 years with the agency. Our Chief of Operations, Marie Noonan, has been in her role for 2 years, 21 years with the agency. Community, Family, and Program Support, again, that's the one that primarily works with our providers and oversees contracts and things like that. Michael Donati oversees that bureau. He's been in that role for 3 years, been with DCYF for 18. Sununu Youth Services Center is overseen by Rhonda Chassie, who previously was known as Rhonda Hinault, maybe to some of you. She's been in that role for 2.5 years, 23 years with the agency. Professional Strategic Development, Kimberly Crow is our Bureau Chief there. She's been with that role for 3 years, previously the Bureau of Organizational Learning and Quality Improvement, 14 years with the agency. Evaluation, Analytics, and Reporting, Lila Roback, she's been in that role for just under a month, it's brand new. And Business Information Systems is Steve DeGuizo, who has been in that role for 14 years.
And what's his relationship to DOIT? What's he doing that's needs to be specific for your department as opposed to being provided by DOIT?
So he manages largely manages our case management system. It's called the current one's called a SACWIS system. We call it Bridges. SACWIS stands for Statewide Automated Child Information System, something like that. Anyway, our current system is 20+ years old. He's the person who works for the department overseeing that system with a couple of staff. Previously, he reported to the DHHS corresponding bureau that Dave Wieters oversees. A couple of years ago, that was changed to have him again sit within DCYF, although the function is essentially the same. It's just his reporting line is a little bit different. But he and his staff are the ones who are responsible for managing and maintaining that system in partnership with the department and DOIT. There is a project underway that I referred to earlier to update this really, really antiquated 23 or more year old system that we're currently using, which I think we're all very excited about getting that done, but that's a couple years from realization.
Thank you.
The request around if there was 5% increase or decrease, what would we do with those funds? If we did have additional funding, where I would recommend that money go is in 2 different places. One, as I referenced a little while ago, we are having some challenges around when we need to make referrals out to community services, particularly to FRCs. And I think that network could use some more support, which would allow us to feel better about those referrals that we need to make to those services. Similarly, in the juvenile justice world, a lot of work is happening through that system of care, but there are what's called diversion programs around the state that aren't currently state funded. And there's not currently really a state endorsed model for that. And I think that is a place where if we had additional funds, it would be helpful to put some additional funds there to be able to better serve kids before they get into the deep ends of both of these systems. Decreased funding, I think, unfortunately, would lead to a lot of negative outcomes along the lines of what we saw when the budgets were slashed 10 years ago and DCYF ended up in the crisis position that it was shortly before I got here. I think we would see caseloads grow, quality of assessments decline, recidivism increase, increased children in out-of-home care, decreased family preservation and reunification, And in the long term, we probably see more families needing the deep end of the system, which ends up being more costly in the long run. I think we're largely living with the repercussions of what was done 10 years ago in terms of defunding the child protection and child welfare system, and are just now starting to see the data shift around these kids in care and everything else. So I just would hate to see us go back to that place.
So just to respond to the increased recidivism as a cost of decrements, that one is just hard for me to wrap my head around, given we have such a high recidivism rate right now. And it seems like we've spent a lot of money at the Sununu Center.
When I was using the word recidivism there, I wasn't thinking just SYSC. I'm thinking recidivism in terms of recurring juvenile justice and also child abuse and neglect recurring. So I'm not thinking specifically of SYSC. I'm thinking about recurring families coming through the system that could have their needs met and stopped from coming through the system.
All right, thank you for the clarification. Do you have any way to put a little bit more analytical precision into these impacts?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of these are actually things that we report on currently within our annual data book, and we actually have a new monthly dashboard that we're posting as well, in terms of caseloads, in terms of children in out-of-home care. Those things are already reported on regularly. Repeats is something that we're trying to figure out, particularly the repeat families who come into our community-based voluntary services is one that we're developing a metric for so that we can actually track that going forward. So yes, I think that, these are things that some of them we're currently reporting on and others that we're developing reports on. Increased long-term demand, that's something that I think you would look at, comparable things to what we're actually already reporting on in terms of new assessments, call volume to the hotline, number of new child protection cases opening up, which are metrics that we do report on regularly.
Yeah. So thank you for that. And I think we're getting close to Ms. Rounds talking. And so the segue that she may want to pick up is, I saw an email conversation on trying to find the right line items to put the funding into the family resource centers if we were to follow the governor's request. So we've heard the governor's request, Mr. Ribson, and I think we're trying to figure out which lines need how much money, and then we have to run it through our process of figuring out what we can spend and what we need to cut. So we're working that on your behalf.
Thank you. Great. And yes, with that, I'm completed with my section. I think Ms. Rounds is stepping up unless there's other questions.
Are there any questions for Mr. Ribson before he steps away? Are you going to stay with us, or are you going to go back to work?
No, I'll still be here. Just won't be talking as much.
All right.
Don't count on that. You can go ahead and stop, or if you want to cover this one, then I can share.
Sure. The only prioritized needs that were identified within the budget were around SYSC. There's the barn roof and boiler that need to be repaired and replaced. The utilities, I think, are funded somewhere else. They're not currently sitting in the SYSC budget. They really belong there. So that's what these are.
So am I seeing that right, that you need another $1 million a year?
Well, this is a one-time cost. I think one of the challenges with SYSC is it's not just the relatively new building that people think of, but it's this campus of aged and oftentimes, buildings that need a lot of care to be maintained. And this is one of those things that needs to be done to maintain that building, if in fact we want to maintain that building.
I would also mention that the barn roof and boiler were also submitted as capital items, and they were not approved in the capital budget, or are not, I should say, are not currently in House Bill 25. That's how I should say it.
So Representative Wallner has a question, I think, maybe as we transition here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, my question is about utilities for $583,000 each year. That's $1 million. do we have enough, when we come to the utility line, do we have enough in utilities to pay our utility bills over the next 2 years?
So we've been regularly paying the utility bill out of the facilities budget for the entire department because we've not been able to increase the budget at SYSC to pay the utilities out of the SYSC budget.
Okay. So if we were to put money in this line, then we should be able to decrease it from another line.
Potentially, I would have to double check to make sure that they budgeted it in that bureau, but that's where we've been paying that.
Because we should only need to budget an additional increment for increased costs, but if the base is being paid for somewhere else, we just need to transfer the base.
I will confirm that and we'll submit change requests for that.
So the part of that is just how much is that of that 583 is like inflation versus the base from previous years. But
Okay.
Representative Wallner, you have another question?
Yes, my question is, so basically what we're saying here is that the Sununu Center actually cost us $1 million more over the biennium than what we see in the budget. And are there any other expenses of the Sununu Center that are not shown in the budget that are being borne from by other areas of the department?
So I would say, I don't know that it's $1 million a year because it's just the utilities that are reoccurring. The barn roof and boiler would be a one-time.
No, I'm saying
for the biennium. Yes, for the biennium, correct. I can get you the information on when there are times that other parts of the budget are paying for expenditures at SYSC. I think for the most part, the only other time that it happens is when there are employees from elsewhere in the department that have to cover shifts at SYSC because there are not enough staff on a shift and we need to pay for the overtime. So we tend to leave the overtime where that employee lives regularly.
So if I could just have one follow-up.
Yes.
So what that indicates to me is that the cost at the Sununu Center is even higher than what we see in the budget.
Yes.
Because there are other places it's being borne. Okay, thank you.
I think for the utilities line, that's true. The increased overtime is because of the inability to actually fill vacant positions for YCs. If we had all of our positions filled that are funded, we probably wouldn't need to rely on overtime from juvenile justice probation officers. But the vacancies at SYSC sometimes puts us in a position where we need to bring in other folks to cover shifts. Filling those positions will actually probably cost less in the net because a full-time YC costs less than the overtime for a juvenile probation officer.
That's a good point, Joe. And we do, I think last year for sure, and I think this year as well, there are some lapsed salary funds anticipated out of the SYSC budget.
So that would mean if we are actually hiring the right people in the right department, then the overtime would be reduced in the department that's been carrying it.
That's correct. A lot of the juvenile justice overtime is that it's covering this. Hiring people for those positions has proven to be very difficult, though. There's a lot of reasons for that.
I'm just wondering if we're talking about a material amount of money. Are we talking about $10,000 a year of overtime, or $100,000, or some crazy number?
Yeah, I don't know the number, but I'm sure it's material because particularly during COVID, when we had to run quarantine and isolation units as well, the need for overtime had increased even more because we needed to run fewer units or have fewer youth on more units, I should say. So there's been more overtime needed during that period, but even in the year prior, there was overtime as a result of not having enough youth counselors to work the regular needed shifts.
Okay, so I think to the point that Representative Wallner was making so effectively is that overtime, it probably wasn't worth doing cost transfers between departments, but it is another source of expenses. If we wanted to know what the true cost of the Sununu Center was, we would have to move some dollars over into a cost management system to figure it out.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So Representative Rogers, do you have your question?
Yes. How many positions there are funded right now but unfilled?
There's quite a few. I can find that. I think I have that data in an email. I just don't know off the top of my head. I can find that for us before we finish.
And a follow-up, are there contracted positions there as well?
The contracted positions there are a full-time psychologist and a part-time psychiatrist through the Dartmouth contract. And right now there are some cleaning staff that are contracted.
Can you get those to us as well? As the unfunded but unfilled?
I don't know if you heard her question. Representative Rogers was asking for data, and I don't know if Ms. Rounds or Mr. Ribson would get it, but
You can get, when you get us the unfunded but unfilled, if you can also get us the contracted.
Yes.
Thank you.
follow up, or are you satisfied for now? Okay, because your hand's still up. Oh, all right. So good. What's this?
So this is the staffing in child protection. So we're going back to sort of the beginning of the presentation from Director Ribson talking about child protection staffing. So this is representing where that staffing is throughout the accounting units. As noted there and as discussed before, 22 of the positions, the CPSW positions are unfunded in the current budget in front of you.
Remind me, is a foster care health program the same thing as a foster care program?
No,
Or is this just like a healthcare insurance program or something? I don't know what the word health adds.
The foster care health program is, it was recently expanded in the last biennium. It's actually something that the department had in the prior decade that was cut when a bunch of other things were cut in the child protection budget. But what this is, it is nurses co-located in district offices to help manage the physical health care needs of youth in out-of-home care. There were two people in those positions, and in the last biennium, that was increased to have enough nurses to be able to work across the state with all the youth in out-of-home care.
So what's the right ratio for that? Is that like one nurse for every 1,000 people in the system, or 100 people in the system?
So the right ratio is actually a lot lower than ours under the current system. We had a program, so actually New Hampshire had this program before we did in New Jersey, but when we built it in New Jersey, it was built around a ratio of one nurse to 50 youth in out-of-home care. I think Utah has a similar ratio to that. The ratio here is closer to one nurse to 100 youth in out-of-home care.
Thank you. And then Representative Wallner is going to ask about the vacancy rates on this slide.
You beat me to it.
Yeah, I'm learning. So do you want to tell us your vacancy rates here?
I'll have to, off the top of my head, as I shared before, I think it's somewhere in the number of 30s for child protection caseworkers. I'll have to check on the other roles. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go ahead and steal the screen sharing from you, Joe.
Oh, sure. You want me to close mine?
I just stole it, you're good. So the next slide here is the pie charts, which you're accustomed to seeing. You'll note several bulleted points at the bottom of this slide as to some of the changes that you're seeing from 18-19, 2021 to 22-23. We moved the DCYF budget portion of this budget into the Medicaid portion of the DCYF budget into the Medicaid budget. I know that's something we've talked about, or may have come up in a question that I've sent to Kevin Ripple before. So this is not a reduction in the DCYF budget. It's just moving those expenditures into the Medicaid budget. It was the only place left in the DHHS budget where we were putting federal Medicaid dollars somewhere other than the Medicaid budget. Everywhere else in the budget, similar to what you saw at New Hampshire Hospital, where that's now agency income instead of federal income, we're trying to keep the Medicaid dollars in the Medicaid budget. And so that's why you see that reduction here from the 150 to the 139, and also the related decrease in federal funds.
So is this Medicaid shift, does that account for the 45 million or so completely?
A vast majority of it. The other things that it is related to are the other two bullets there, which is what Joe had been talking about earlier, that SSBGA and the kinship program have been moved to economic and housing stability, which is one of the family resource center programs that we've been talking about. And then also the rest of the parental assistance programs were moved to the Division of Public Health Services as a prioritized need, which you'll hear about later next week. But those are also on the list from the governor.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, we can jump right into the accounting units. The first one is 2956, which is on page 933. This does start at the bottom of page 933, just after Department of Transportation finishes.
So my eyes blur a little bit. Which title are we looking at right now?
We are in 2956, which is Office of the Director, -DCYF. It's the very first accounting unit of DHHS in the budget book.
So there's a fairly significant jump going from FY21 to FY22 in general funds.
Yes, this is mostly due to the position increase. Rebecca, can you just speak to what positions were moved into this accounting unit and perhaps where they were moved from, or were they converged?
Sure. There is 4 positions that are moving from what is currently known as the Bureau of Organizational Learning, BOCI, that's 2960. And then there's 1 position coming from Juvenile Justice. So it's a legal person, and then it's part of a new piece in that would be on the slide that Joe had shown previously.
The new bureau that was created.
His general counsel legislative liaison group.
So Ms.
So
Lord,
these are just, these are just being moved. They're not new positions.
could you help us with just like a little cheat sheet to show, where these plus ups, where they're being subtracted from other parts of the budget, just so we can see the debit equal the credit?
We actually already provided that for the whole department, so Kevin should have that already.
Yep, I think I sent that out in one of my emails, and it's also on the Division 3 webpage.
We can't hear you, Chair.
No, I'm saying you're great. You're all over it. Thank you.
You're welcome. So if there are no other questions there, the next accounting unit is 2957, which is child protection. This is where the child protective CPSW positions are.
This shows a fairly significant increase from FY21 to FY23. It goes up like $4 million.
Yes. But in this current biennium, we had SB 6, which provided us more supervisors and CPSW staff that was in its own accounting unit. The dollars were only allowed to be used for that specific purpose. And this biennium going forward, we're putting all of them in the same accounting unit. They all function the same.
Representative Irf?
Yeah, could you just refer to which number that was, Kevin, that the document is? That you were just talking about on the last slide, which also relates to this one, I think, moving positions.
I don't know that it referenced a specific question. However,
How about
the
this then?
document
The thing labeled FY position compare?
I think it's the one labeled DHHS position movement. So on the webpage, at least, it's the last item that's listed.
Okay, I'll go back and try to find it. I thought I had them all here. Thank you.
Yep.
I don't see any other questions on this.
The next accounting unit is 2958. This accounting unit is where all of the services related to DCYF child protection live. This is where you'll note that 535 was the Medicaid expenditures that have been moved. So that's why you're seeing a big $30 million expenditure now at 0.
The same with class 563. It's also moved to Medicaid.
Okay, thank you.
So Representative Irf, your hand is still up. Do you have another question or? No, all right, keep going. I don't see any other questions.
The next accounting unit is 2959, which is the domestic violence programs.
Now, it looks like in FY18, which you don't have, it was really pretty small. And then from FY20 to FY23, it looks like it really hasn't changed much. Small percentage increases. Is that because we haven't had a growth in domestic violence or what? I mean, I'm just curious, that line item hasn't grown as aggressively as other line items.
So this is an area that I know that the governor made purposeful investments last biennium in fiscal year 20 and 21, which is probably why you're seeing lower expenditures in some of those earlier years. So that's what I would say. I don't know if Joe has anything else to add to that.
No, I think they're also a big piece of it is also federal funds and federal grant funding that are not driven by our decisions, but driven by what formula grants apply to New Hampshire.
Yeah, no, I see that. The federal funds are growing faster than our general funds. Right. Do you have a question, Representative Wallner? You're on mute.
Sorry. Is there a match requirement for the federal funds? Or
No,
maybe-
there's not.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Your hand's still up, Representative Wallner.
I'll put it down.
So moving on to the next accounting unit is 2960, which is the Organizational Learning and Quality Improvement Bureau.
Any questions here?
Okay. The next accounting unit is 2961, the Foster Care Health Program.
This is why we see the big jump from FY20 to FY21, because we went and hired some nurses to look after our foster care settings.
That's correct. And these, Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe we earn Medicaid admin on this, and it is a higher than 50-50, if I recall correctly.
Correct.
Yes.
Back to 2960, the travel, out-of-state travel.
So I think Representative Weiler, your microphone's on. Do you have a question about travel?
Yes, in 2960, out-of-state travel, $25,000.
Joe, do you want to speak to how that bureau may incur out-of-state travel?
Well, this is the bureau where all the training costs are kept for the division. So my assumption is that is those are associated with training costs. I'm not sure, Rebecca, are there other travel costs in there beyond training?
There's a few conferences that staff would attend annually. I think previously it wasn't funded. It was one of the prioritized needs for the current biennium, and it wasn't funded.
How many people?
So I think Joe is saying this is for his entire division. So it's for all 400, 500 employees.
Yeah, actually, I think it's closer to 700 employees. But yes, it's
Oh, sorry, 700.
it's this is the training costs for the entire division are within this budget.
You have a follow-up, Representative Weiler?
I guess all the training is done out of state.
There's a lot of training that's required. It's not all done out of state. There's a lot of training done in state, but there's a lot of training that is required for our staff.
I'm not seeing other questions. Do you want to continue?
I think we were on 2961.
Foster care health program.
I don't know if there are any additional questions on that.
Just what's
Oh,
the
wait,
increase?
Representative Erf does. Representative Erf, you have a question?
Yes, the 18% increase, just wondering what that is. In general funds.
In the foster care health program?
2961,
In 2961, foster care health program general funds went from, looks like I see 367,000 to 431, 432,000 roughly in the budget.
this was because of the new positions,
But
the
it
new
shows-
nursing positions.
Okay, the chairman mentioned that, but I just see 19 for the permanent classifieds all the way through. Should there have been different numbers in there?
I think they weren't funded in fiscal year 20. They didn't get funded until 21, if I remember correctly. They got added to the total budget, but they didn't get funded until the second year of the biennium.
Right, but I'm looking at the second year of the biennium cost, and that's the thing that jumps into the first year of the.
The total cost
So-
also goes up as well, though.
I'm not questioning that.
Okay, so the general funds would have to go up if the total cost is going up because the earn percentage.
That's not the question I'm asking, Karen. If you
Okay.
said you added the person in 21, that's this year,
Yep,
and that total is that annual total is 367,
yes,
and that includes that person, correct?
yes.
Well, next year is 431, 432, same count. Or did you just add that person late in the year or something?
So you're saying, so if you look at the screen, so you're saying here it's 367 and then it goes to 431.
Correct.
Why is that increasing?
Yes.
Okay, so the total costs go from 1.4 million to 1.7 million, and the general fund earn is about 25%. This federal funds are 75%, the general funds are 25%. So the total percentage on the total didn't change. It's the total cost that went up,
It would be for step increases.
which is.
Maybe that's the right answer, because it's not related to people if the people stay the same.
Well, right, the salaries increase because of step increases, the benefits increase because of pay increases.
So the step this time was between this year and next year? And then there's another, so there's a step every year. That's the 5.6%.
Correct. And then also fiscal year 23 has an extra pay period.
Okay. Thank you.
And part of the reason that this might be a larger jump than some other areas is these were all vacant positions. And when they're vacant, they're budgeted at step one. So if we hire if we hire them at a higher pay because of their experience or their education, then that's going to make this first year number higher.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry.
Well, those are good questions. Thank you. Okay, I think we can move on to juvenile field services.
I don't think we got all the way through these accounting units.
Oh, I thought juvenile field services was next. It's not. Go to your next. I'm just looking at my sheet.
No, I don't believe so. So the next one was a workman's comp, which, as I've discussed, we moved to OCOM. So hold on, sorry. Now I've lost my place. That was 2961. So then workman's comp 2967 should be the next accounting unit on page 941. 2967, which is Child Welfare Services 4B, which is 100% federal. Okay. The next.
So Mr. Ripple, I'm looking at the spreadsheet that you put together off of the DHH baseline, DHHS FY 18-23.
Yep.
And it looks like I'm maybe missing this account.
So that was based off of the spreadsheet used in the department's briefing book, which only had accounts of $1 million or greater. So a smaller account wouldn't be in there.
Okay, so there is that line, accounts less than $1 million. So I
That's
got
right.
it. All right.
Okay, so we're on accounting unit 2968, which is Title 4B Subpart 1, again, 100% federal. Okay. The next one is 2969, Child Abuse Prevention CAPTA, again, 100% federal. The next accounting unit is 2970, which is Teen Independent Living. That continues on to page 944, also 100% federal.
Independent living. I didn't think we had an emancipation program in New Hampshire. How does a teen legally end up living independently? I guess after high school, or who are these teens?
This is some of the federal funding used to support transition age youth, right? So typically these would be 18-year-olds, right, who are transitioning from foster care.
Okay, and then we've extended the ability for foster care to voluntarily go to 21 as another way of handling it?
Yes.
Okay, Representative Urf, you have a question?
Just a general question. There's about a half a dozen of these all federal fund accounts. So does the federal government basically just say, we want to have these kinds of things done and here's the money for it?
Yeah, they're largely formula grant funded. So these different types of programs where the federal government puts some restrictions around how the funds should be used, and then divvied up by the states based on, per capita.
Thank you.
Okay. The next accounting unit is 2971, Adolescent Aftercare, which is also 100% federal. Joe, what is aftercare?
So aftercare is typically, it's typically less money used for youth who are still having some challenges beyond the age of, when they would age out of the system. So these are not kids who are actively in the foster care program or kids who are, who we're providing, direct support for, but They could be kids who have aged out of the system who have some type of, short-term discrete need. Again, these are kind of federal funds for that, to meet that purpose.
Okay. Thank you.
The next one is 2972, which is adolescent purchase services. This is 100% federal funds.
Any questions?
Okay, the next one is 2973, which is promoting safe, stable families. Also a federal grant.
How do we promote safe, stable families? What's like the main tool in our toolkit for promoting safe, stable families? Is this counseling or is it something else?
I'd have to, with all of these grants being relatively small amounts of money with overlapping missions, a lot of them are used to fund, the same programs. I'd have to go back and look at exactly which grants are funding which programs. But some of these funds are used to do foster care recruitment and things like that. Some of these funds are used for supporting our adoption program. We have the adoptnh.org where people can learn about kids who are legally free for adoption. Some of these funds are used to fund portions of some of our other programming. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I'll have to double check and get back to you, but they tend to just cover a small piece of other programming because they are relatively small dollar amount grants.
Sure. Between the 2 years, it's 1.3 million. So it's almost like real money.
Yeah, but you can't build a comprehensive system with it, right? You can.
No, I know.
You can meet.
I'm just curious what it is, but it's not urgent. That can be, as we approach summer and we need something to talk about.
If I could just add that on the key accomplishments on the presentation that Joe provided, on the last one, the roadmap to reunification, the partnerships, some of these dollars go to fund part of those contracts.
Yes. Thank you, Rebecca.
You're welcome.
All right. I think we're ready for the next.
The next one is 2974, which is adoption services. All right, also a small federal grant.
So again, my eyes are having a tough time focusing because I'm using the screen. I'm not seeing any. Okay, so it's basically a little less than $200,000 a year.
Yes, 195,000. Yep.
Oh, so one day I'd like to have a conversation about what we can do to help the adoption process. What we can do, what the challenges are with getting kids adopted, and what we might be able to do to facilitate that. Whether it's making the legal process easier or something. I'd really like to talk about the adoption, where we are with the adoption system. We can make that a May-June conversation.
Sure.
Okay, next.
Next accounting unit 2975 is no longer being used, and the same is true with 8903, which now does wrap up the child protection area. So if I go back over here to the slide deck, that was the last accounting unit, 8903. And the next area is juvenile justice, which is made up of 108 employees. The total budgets are as follows, not much changing from year to year other than staff increases.
So this is under the just general title of Juvenile Field Services.
So there are two accounting units associated with this. The first one is 7905 on page 953.
Where is the field? Is the field all over the state? They travel all over the state, or is the field, these folks work at 3 or 4 facilities?
These folks work at the district offices throughout the state, and they serve families throughout the state. Their
You
home
have
office
13.
are the same as the DHHS district offices.
If you have 13. All right.
Okay, so the first accounting unit is 7905, which starts at page 953 and goes on to 954.
Are there any questions? I'm not seeing any.
Okay, the other accounting unit associated with this area is 7906, which is JJDP, which, if I recall correctly, Joe, is a grant.
Yes,
Primary.
federal grant.
And does this grant is this the one that has a committee associated with it that determines how the funds are spent?
That's correct. Yeah, the state advisory group is under executive order.
Questions?
All right. Go back over to the slide deck and the last bunch of accounting units. So I think we'll meet your 3:15 deadline, hopefully, Chair, is SYSC. This shows the total positions. What I would note is there have been several reductions in positions over the past several bienniums, and those positions have not been abolished. They've only been unfunded. So when you look at the total positions, you see those 22 positions in the position count, but there is no funding for those 22 positions. And if you're looking at the comparison from the agency phase to the governor's phase, we did accidentally fund some of those in the agency phase, and the correction was made in the governor's phase. It was just an accident.
Sure. So what is the decision that needs to be made? If we're not going to fund a position, why do we carry the head count or the FTE count still? Why not just reduce the number of recommended positions?
I wouldn't necessarily say we need all of these unfunded positions. I will say there is value to having some unfunded positions in areas where there are smaller numbers of staff. And unfortunately, that's why we do see a lot of folks go out on medical leave, injury, things like that. For example, if we lose a maintenance staff or something like that as a result of some type of injury or medical leave, those grounds are so large and complex that we can't really live without those people for too long, and being able to fund an unfunded position is a lot easier than creating a new position. So I think there is benefit organizationally to being able to have some of that. Certainly, right, having 18 unfunded positions in education are never going to be, that's not necessary.
Let me just comment.
Go ahead.
In the last budget, as a way of keeping the HHS down, at the time they had a whole lot of vacancies. So what the last budget did more or less was freeze the number of positions you have and gave them flexibility to, okay, we really need to hire this person. Well, who just left? You can replace this position with that position. It'd come before fiscal to tell what they had done. And it was a regular thing on fiscals to say, well, we moving these 3 positions to these 3 positions. So basically it was a way to keep the spending down in HHS. It's not a normally used thing. So you had a lot of positions that were, if you will, funded but not filled, because they really weren't funded until another vacancy came available somewhere else. That was just a gimmick. First time we used it. Thank you.
Across the department, you will see in the budget bill that we have abolished 1 position. This biennium, it's a Medicaid position. So that's the position that's been abolished, and it's being replaced by another position. You could call me superstitious, but we had 3 employees in a row pass away while in that position. And so we decided to retire that position number and create a new one. I know, a little strange, call me superstitious, but it was just too strange to have 3 employees in a row pass away and unexpectedly. at a young age.
Especially if the number was 666 or something. So
It wasn't. There was no reason to have suspicion before. So that's the only position abolished in the department.
okay. Any questions?
All right. So the pie charts show that the budget was essentially level funded from 1819 to 2021. There were layoffs at the end of 1819 to achieve that level funding. There was also a back of the budget cut in House Bill 1 that specifically related, in addition to our department-wide budget cut, but excuse me, back of the budget cut, there was an additional back of the budget cut that specifically related to SYSC. Excuse me.
All right, thank you.
The additional other funds that you're seeing here are potential funds from Vermont, which may or may not happen.
From what? Ops? Did you say ops?
No, the state of Vermont and the contract that we have with them.
Yeah, I misheard. All right.
Sorry. So the first accounting unit in this area is 7909, which is on page 956. Starts here sort of at the middle of the page, which is the SYSC Director's Office.
Any questions here?
This is an area, as I've mentioned, that unemployment and workman's comp we keep within the facility because the workman's comp especially can be very unique to the facility. Injuries are very different than somebody like me who's in an office. So we do keep those separately within the facilities budgets. We don't bring them to the full department level. So really the next one is 7913, which is materials management.
Okay.
So that had a bit of a jump. Is that related to the barn / roof?
I think it was more just trying to budget at the level that we've experienced in fiscal year 20. They spent about 35,000, so we budgeted 37. Rebecca, was there any other reason that?
No, just potential increase in costs. This is an area where this is our warehouse, and it's hygiene products for the kids, mattresses, cleaning supplies, clothing.
So is this is material management for the Sununu Center or a larger area than that?
Just SYSC.
For the kids, just SYSC, yeah.
So this is one that actually should be really correlated to the number of people that are being guests of the facility, plus inflation. Okay. All right, thank you.
The next accounting unit is 1203, which is food preparation.
Okay, so someday if I ever were to ask you what the average cost of each meal is, you'd be able to tell me?
So we can come fairly close because at one time we were providing meals to another part of the facility for a contractor. So we had come up with estimates. So if you want, we could provide you what we had come up with at that time, which is about a year ago.
We're gonna be asking you a bunch of stuff. That would be an interesting trivia question sometime.
One we can answer.
Representative Weiler has a question.
Now, at one time, before we opened the new Sununu Center, the meal costs were much lower. Then they opened the Sununu Center and the meal costs went up high. And it was because you had almost a 24-hour kitchen or cafeteria, as it were. Are we still maintaining that cafeteria for the dozen kids that are there?
There does remain a cafeteria and a food service. It's not running 24 hours, serving 3 meals a day.
Does it serve 3 meals a day?
Yes.
It's probably 18 hours or so, 13, 14, whatever.
You have
How many meals a day are they serving?
Depends on the census, but 3 meals a day.
We'll have a full staff.
Yeah, the staffing there has been reduced over the years from what it was. But yeah, there are staff there to prepare those 3 meals a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year.
Probably 4 or 3.
Yeah, that sounds about right. I think there are.
On the next
Do you know
page,
how
right?
many are full? I think there might be 4 filled, 4 positions.
Personnel should be, yeah.
6 positions, but I think going back to here,
There's 6 and 1 is unfunded currently.
And I think 1's vacant and not without the intent to fill. So I think it is 4 that are actually.
Thank you.
Representative Weiler, your hand is still up. I assume you're done. Representative Wallner?
Karen, I was wondering, you were showing that on the prioritized needs, you needed another $500,000 each year for utilities. Where would that show up?
so I believe that
where
would,
should it show up?
I believe that would be in the next budget, which would be 7914 maintenance. Is that correct, Rebecca?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Irf?
Are we on 7914?
Yes,
We're
I
about
think
to get there.
That was actually the question I had earlier. I didn't have material management and maintenance separated when I was looking at this. That's why I was asking about the barn/roof. I was looking at the increase there from this year to next in that accounting unit, 7914, which is the maintenance.
Rebecca, can you speak to the increase
Yeah.
in current expenses?
Yes. The increase is due to the cleaning contract that we have for the extra cleaning due to the COVID.
But wouldn't that have been included in this year too? Adjusted authorized?
Well, it wasn't something that we had budgeted. It was something that we had to do because of the COVID.
Right, but I'm looking at the adjusted authorized at just under 700,000, and then I'm looking at next year's recommended at a bit under $1,950,000. Am I looking at the right line? The total for that department?
Right. It's in the actual for 20, but it's not in 21. And it was only part of the year in 20.
I'm a little confused. I'm looking at 21 to 22.
Okay. So there's no cost in there for the cleaning contract that we currently have because of COVID.
There's no cost in the 21 actual, adjusted authorized for the cleaning, is that what?
Correct.
Okay, but there is in the
Correct.
next budget cycle?
Yes. Yes.
So all the money you spent on cleaning this year, where is that? Where does that show up?
Well, we are going to have to move money to pay for that. This is just the adjusted budget at the beginning of July. So you wouldn't see any expenditures right now.
Oh, so this adjusted authorized is as way back to July? No.
Yeah.
Yes. This is not actual expended.
Okay, I guess I need to understand what adjusted authorized means. Okay.
July, it means July.
Well, that's the beginning of the budget year. I wonder what they're adjusting at that point. That hadn't even started.
Right, it doesn't change until we go to fiscal committee and have items approved.
So I think we can go off of maintenance. The health, I think it's health services, but
Yes, 7915 is health services, that's correct.
these are health services for who? Who are the beneficiaries?
The youth in the facility. So I believe this has nursing, 24/7 nursing staff for the facility, as well as the contracted dental services, physician services, psychiatric and psychological. I think they're in here too, right, Rebecca? The Dartmouth, the psychologist and psychiatrist.
Correct, as well as drugs, prescriptions for the kids, all that type of stuff.
Okay. So that's 2.5 million for throughput in a given year of is about 108, 100 and so.
I don't think I fully heard that question.
No, I'm trying to figure out the math, how much we're health services we're paying per child that transitions through the facility. If we put about 100 distinct individuals through Sununu in a given year, 1.3 million works out to be about $1,300 per resident. You know, and that would just be an average. Am I missing some math? That just sounds like that sounds like a pretty decent amount of money.
I think this is a place where, again, those economies of scale have really impacted to operate a 24/7 nursing staff for fewer youth. So when you try to calculate it by youth days, it adds up.
Have you guys ever looked at telemedicine as a way of providing some of your healthcare staff so that you don't have to have physical bodies on site all the time?
You know, I'd be anxious not having a nurse in the facility, given some of the challenges that we see with our young people. You know, I don't know that our youth counselors or others would be in a position to kind of provide that type of support through a telehealth connection.
I would say it would also potentially increase our Medicaid expenditures because it probably would increase a child being taken to the hospital. So then they'd have to be transported to the hospital, and then many of the children are Medicaid. Medicaid would then be charged for the services. And as we know, hospitals charge more than what we could provide their services for.
Okay, Representative Weiler, you had your hand up, sir.
Yes, thank you. Both in 7914 and 7915, we've got agency income that we didn't have in 20 and 21. When did we suddenly start collecting?
The money for the Vermont contract for the kids that we potentially might have, that's where those two areas we budgeted those dollars. So if we don't get the kids, then we would potentially need other dollars to fund those.
Thank you.
Representative Wallner.
Could I just understand a little clearer what Rebecca just said? So are you saying that we're budgeting in $500,000 each year from Vermont? But if we don't get it from Vermont, if that doesn't come, we will have to replace that with general fund dollars?
Or spend less, yes.
Or spend less in this category?
Yes. Or if we needed to move funds from somewhere else in SYSC and spend less than somewhere else in there, or potentially from somewhere else in the department, which I know in past years there's been wording in House Bill 2 to say that we have to come to fiscal committee to transfer even $1 into SYSC. So it would come to fiscal committee if that language was there again. which I assume it will be.
You have another question? You both, how about you, Representative Weiler?
How many kids from Vermont was possible in that contract?
The contract had a ceiling of 6 at a given time, but that was, we know that it will, I would be shocked if it ever reached that ceiling. I think it's much more likely that we'll see between 0 and 2 kids there at a given time.
And
this was just developed to make sure that we had the capacity in case there was additional need.
A lot
And
cheaper per kid than what we're paying.
we budgeted at the 1 to 2 kid level. We didn't budget at the total of 6, knowing that that would be unlikely.
Yeah, I think, Rebecca, do you remember what the daily rate is that we're charging them? It was based on a calculation of the state fiscal year 19, daily cost.
Yeah, I want to say it was over $1,000 a day. I'm not 100% sure.
It was, I think it was over, I thought it was over 12 or 13, but
Yeah, I'm thinking so.
Could I ask?
Representative Weiler, go ahead.
Yes, are there other areas in this budget where you are also scheduling Vermont money to come in? This isn't the only area where you would expect Vermont.
The funds,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, the funds for the Vermont revenue potentially were only budgeted in 2 class lines. The current one, the 7914, and then in the one that we're just discussing, 7915.
Okay, so in 7914, there was 200 and is that 230,000 that you scheduled from Vermont?
Correct.
And then another 500,000 in the health.
508. Correct.
Okay. So $750,000 each year is in this budget as revenue that's coming from Vermont that we don't really know whether we're getting.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
If I might just say, so there is other revenue budgeted within Sununu, but that is for from DOE for the meals.
Yeah.
And then the school, if a child has an IEP, then we can bill the school district for that.
Questions? I think we can go on.
All right, the next one is 7916, which is rehabilitative programs.
Not seeing any questions.
Actually, I do have a question, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Is that current expenses? Just out of curiosity, what does that mean?
Rebecca, what are the current expenses the best way to see? I mean, they're typically supplies, but what are they here?
Let me just look. I'm going to have to get back to you on that. This is out of 7916.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't need to tell me what they are. Just curious as to why there's a 20% jump and then a 16% jump in your budgeted figures. If I'm looking at the right one.
For fiscal year 22 is pretty much in line with what we actually spent in fiscal year 20. It's $250 more, but we can get back to you on what that includes.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? I think we can proceed.
And 7917 is rehabilitative education. This is one of those areas that Rebecca was mentioning about the funds that come from DOE. I'm not hearing any questions. So the very last accounting unit is 7919, which is chapter 1.
That's sort of federal. That's what it's called. That looks like that's all federal money.
It is.
Correct.
I believe those are the other funds you were talking about that come from DOE as well.
This is the Title I grant that comes from DOE.
Are there any other questions? Because that looks like it may wrap up the accounting phase.
It does. And that is also the end of the slide presentation.
So we have 2 or 3 members, I forget. Oh, go ahead, Representative Wallner. What's your question?
So, you know, that we know that the cost of running Sununu is very high per child. What do we know about cost in other states? Where do we fall in the cost per child for running a detention center like this? Where do we compare? Are we high? Are we low? Are we in the middle?
I'm positive we are high in the cost per child calculation. I don't have that data to point to, but I'm sure that it will point to us being high. Again, I think, right, that I know that folks like to think about this in a cost per child way, but I think what's difficult is that when you do the work to keep children out and reduce your economies of scale, that you're going to inflate your cost per child. I think it's, you know, it's other states, we are incredibly low in the number of children detained and committed compared to other jurisdictions as well. And I'm not advocating to shift our policy to detain and commit more kids to resolve this problem. I'm just saying that I think, you know, it's not an apples to apples comparison if you're comparing a state that detains and commits many, many kids to a state that detains and commits very few kids.
Thank
You have a follow-up there?
No.
So, okay, so I think implicit in some of what you've said through the course of the day so far, Mr. Ribson, is that the personnel costs that are associated with providing these services are fixed regardless of how many residents there are in the facility. And I'm just wondering if we can afford a system that is offering services for such a small number of kids, that there must be some more efficient way to, say, provide library access or to provide meals, or I just don't want people to get comfortable with the idea that our personnel costs are fixed. They're only fixed in the short term. So we need to be thinking a little longer. So I just wanted to say that. I'll let you respond.
Yeah, no, I do not disagree. I think the personnel costs are not entirely fixed, right? The YCs are the youth counselors are the most fluid position based on, you know, daily need. And that does get very complex if you think back to the slide that I showed around the average daily census and how it could swing, you know, double in a day and then collapse in half in a day. That makes staffing very, very complex. But those costs will change with the census somewhat. And again, it's not exactly the census, but it's the number of units that need to be run to serve those children that really drives that cost. The other cost,
increment.
What was that?
It's a step increment. You get to a step, you got to add more cost.
Yeah, but it's even more complex than that, because it also, right, you could have one child who requires a coach with them all day, a one-to-one supervision all day. And that's dependent on that child's needs when they show up. And that need may change over time as that child stabilizes. But they're very unpredictable costs. So I think that's a real challenge with managing a facility that is that is as high acuity as this is. Some of the other costs that are more fixed in the current structure are the education program, the nursing program, those types of things.
I want to ask you about your use of the word acuity. You used it earlier. I'm used to acuity being used in a patient care context to refer to the acuity of a patient. And so I'm just imagining that since these are detained kids and committed kids, that by acuity, you mean some tend to be more violent than others or need.
Yes and no. Sometimes it'll manifest as violence, but most of these kids do have complex behavioral health needs. Very few of these kids are absent some type of complex behavioral health need on top of the other challenges that they have. So sometimes it manifests as violence and sometimes not. I wouldn't say that it's always violence that we're concerned about when I say that. It's really what their needs are and how intense their needs are.
Okay. All right. So are there any other questions? I'm not seeing any. I know we have 2 or 3 reps that need to get on to their next event. And you all are welcome to go when you want. We're going to open up to the attendees to see if anyone has any questions. If those who have to leave can stay just for a little while to listen to some of them, but you'll know that this is on being recorded. So you can come back and listen to the question and answers at your convenience. Representative Wallner, did you have a question?
No, I just wanted to know if we were going to have audience participation at this point.
Oh, I'm trying to integrate that now. And for those of you who are leaving, please take a look at your email. I proposed some work sessions next week. And then after I wrote that email, Mr. Ripple let me know that we've got a couple of bills that got referred to finance and I think are making their way to Division 3 for us to be second committee on. So we have the good fortune of having more work here in the next 19 days than we anticipated. So we'll get some information to you about that. I'll try to ask the policy committees for any good testimony that they got so that we can get ahead of the game a little bit. But Representative Rogers, you're speaking, but you're on mute. Did you have something to say, ma'am? All right. You're talking to Romeo? All right. Okay, so I see a question from Mr. DeJoy. Do you want to bring him in, Mr. Ripple?
Yep, he should be allowed to talk now.
Okay, so before you get started, I don't know how many people are going to want to talk, but I think we're going to try to keep a 3-minute timer on people and ask that you keep it your comments related to a resourcing issue and not a philosophy issue. So you may speak.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have a brief statement, and I hope I can stick to your resource criteria. I just want to start by applauding the department for their work in the probation transformation that was mentioned previously, as well as the transformative work around the system of care. That's integral to child protection, but it's also a linchpin of the juvenile justice system as well. My comments are in relation to the SYSC discussion and the SYSC budget. Waypoint has been working for the closure of SYSC for a number of years now, but the newspaper article this past Tuesday and the extent of the alleged abuse at SYSC has raised this conversation to a new level. For the past 6 years, we've undertaken at Waypoint many efforts to try to engage the department in conversations about next steps and moving away from the correctional model at SYSC. But that has not been effective. The system today at SYSC operates essentially the same as it has since it opened. And that's part of what we're talking about as far as the costs is the model and the structure. The only legislative effort that has had significant impact is House Bill 517, which is what dropped the census in large part from in the mid-60s to where it is today. These are 100%, nearly 100% general fund dollars. And as the number of kids committed to SYSC has decreased, the budgets continue to increase. And the question for us remains, is this the least restrictive setting and the most clinically appropriate facility for children? I think we have before us, or more appropriately, you have before you, an opportunity to transform this facility and transform the treatment for some of the most complex children, children with some of the most complex behavioral health needs in the state. Our neighbor to the west, Vermont, has undertaken a similar effort just in the past year. They closed Woodside, which is their only juvenile corrections facility, around August or September of last year. And we can learn a significant amount from their efforts. They've grappled with some of the same issues that we've been talking about here today. And I would note that they recently signed a contract with a private provider that the new facility will be open, I'm told, by a legislator in Vermont by the end of this calendar year, or just over a year after the decision was made to close Woodside. Just a couple of points to keep in mind about the children we're talking about. These are not hardened criminals. These are children. By the department's own estimates, nearly 75% of these kids have behavioral health needs, typically complex behavioral health needs. And the one thing we know for sure is that every child in the juvenile justice system, by the time they turn 18, is returned to their community or another community for them to live in.
So John, that's 3 minutes, but I'm not seeing any other hands. So maybe you got another 3 minutes, but that should.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Hopefully I won't need it. I think I need about another minute and a half. So thank you. The conversation about recidivism was very interesting, and the 60% number is what I've heard as well. That number tracks pretty closely with juvenile justice programs across the country, interestingly, as well as adult correctional facilities across the country. So in addition to the budget that you're talking about, you also have House Bill 254 that will be before you momentarily. This is a bill that we've advanced that, like House Bill 517, further restricts the kids that can be committed to Sununu. This bill, along with the transformations that have been mentioned through Families First and the system of care, position us to have fewer and fewer kids at this facility and make the opportunity for change all the more paramount. What I would point out is that across the country in juvenile justice, when significant change is made to facilities such as Sununu, it is not made by the managing agency, or in this case, DCYF. Across the country, changes are only made, and closures and specifically are only made through legislative mandate, court mandate, or occasionally through chief executive mandate. Waypoint does not find the SYSC model to be in the best interest of children, and is clearly costly for taxpayers. We believe that now is the time to close SYSC and focus on treating children with the most complex behaviors in more clinically appropriate settings. For this to happen, it will require a definitive pronouncement by the legislature. Short of that, SYSC likely will not close. And with that, I'll conclude my comments.
So Mr. DeJoy, thank you so much for your comments. I used to be in the military, and what we would say to our soldiers oftentimes was, thank you for bringing me a problem. Now bring me a solution. And I would put the same on you, sir. Just to say, I think there's probably broad agreement that something needs to be done, and the real question gets to be exactly what is that something. So to the extent that you can help clarify that with an option or some options at maybe a future date, that would be really great.
Mr. Chair, I'm happy to share that. I have an example of a developed option that I'm happy to share with you and the rest of the division. What I would point out is that what I'm going to send to you is an option. It is not the only option, may not even be the best option, but it is an illustration of a way that we can get to where I'm talking about. And the department may have better ideas than that. And I would be open to working with the department on those ideas.
All right, well, great. So who are you going to send your option to? You going to send it to, do you have? Go ahead.
Mr. Ripple?
Yeah, that'd be great. If you have his address, that's email address, that's great.
Yep. And in an effort of full transparency, I'll send it to Mr. Ribson as well.
And I didn't mean, I didn't mention it, but I try to ask if somebody's a lobbyist to introduce themselves as a lobbyist, and I believe you are, sir.
I am a lobbyist. I'm actually an employee of Waypoint, but I do work in their advocacy department, and I am a registered lobbyist for Waypoint.
Thank you for that. I see Representative Nordgren with her hand up.
I might just comment that John is also a former member of the House and a member of Division 3.
So are we supposed to hold that against him, or is that good?
I would just use that as part of his background in doing what he's trying to help us do today. Thanks.
I would note on that, if I could, for context, the very first budget I sat on was the inaugural budget for Sununu Youth Services Center.
Oh, so we have you to blame.
In some measure, I think that's accurate.
So, okay, so Mr. Ripson, I'm sorry, there's a little lightheartedness there. It's a heavy subject. I don't want to have Mr. DeJoy's words hanging out there without giving you an opportunity to respond however you care to.
Thanks. As I think we've said here, and as I've said here multiple times, I think it's obvious that a decision needs to be made about what's next for secured, detention and commitment in this state. I do believe that the ongoing efforts that Mr. Joy spoke about are going to continue to drive down the need, but that isn't going to. I do not believe that it will eliminate the need. I don't think we've seen a single jurisdiction in this country be able to eliminate the need. We've seen people talk about closing a facility in Vermont only to open up a private facility. San Francisco made big headway when they announced closing their juvenile facility, but their plan was to transfer those kids to the state facility. Missouri closed a lot of facilities. New Jersey's closed a lot of facilities, but they've moved them to other facilities. Nobody's actually been able to eliminate the need. So I think, the idea that there's a closure without a step 2 is a very, very risky, dangerous proposition. And I think that, it would be risky to jump into demanding that something closes at a certain point before a plan is in place to have whatever we go to next.
I just so you know, from a personal perspective, I couldn't agree with you more. As an old plans officer, you don't take step 1 unless you know where you're going to land on step 2. So I get your point. To come back to a question, if we did drive the census down further, it sounds to me like we've structured the services and the personnel that support them in a way in which we might still not be driving down costs much. I mean, we could get to near zero and still have a pretty hefty bill, right?
Yeah, I think some hard decisions are going to have to be made about what some of those fixed costs are in terms of educational programming, food service, medical programming. Like I said, I'm not comfortable with eliminating 24/7 nursing, but to drive down costs, those are the kinds of things that people are going to have to wrestle with, which are not things that I'd be comfortable recommending the elimination of. I do think that, by structuring a new program, we could probably be more thoughtful about how staffing could be used in a different setup. Right now with a lot of space to cover staff, or covering different units that hold large number of kids. So you might be able to gain some efficiencies through different structures of the units through developing a new program. And I think that reduced census, like I said, it's not just the census, it's the units. So it's about figuring out, I think as Representative Wallner said before, what do we do to treat girls if we know that there's only going to be at most a couple girls in the program? I think that there's, it would be difficult to say there's no option for a girl in the state of New Hampshire, but maybe there's a way to think differently about what that looks like as well. So I think there are things that can be done, but it is very complex, and it's hard to do in the absence of knowing what the impacts of our current reforms are going to be. I know that's not satisfactory to a lot of folks, but I'm not particularly comfortable making a prediction on exactly what these small numbers are going to be in future years until we see the impact of some of the reforms that are currently underway.
Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? I don't see any from the committee. I don't see any from the attendees.
I add one thing to that, Chair.
Where are you? Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. So one thing I would just mention, and every legislative committee that has looked at this, of course, evaluates this as well, but I think it's something that has made it difficult from a return on investment standpoint to build a new facility, is that when this building is no longer used for this purpose, there is a potential $10 million payback to the federal government that was part of how the building was paid for when it was built. So that's something we didn't talk about specifically in the presentation, but I think most people know that, but I wanted to mention it so that it's not forgotten.
Well, most people knew that, but I didn't. So I appreciate you telling me. Thank you. All right. Well, it's been to me a productive day. Maybe it was a little more brutal than what you imagined when you came in this morning, Mr. Ripson. But I really appreciate you coming up from New Jersey with all your experience and all you've invested into improving our DCYF program. I think your leadership is well recognized and that you have an incredible reputation. And so if you can help us put together that tough love decision on what to do with this facility, that would be truly a great thing. So. And I believe you have it in you. If you could just, let us know. With that, Mr. Ripple, did I already say to the committee members, I sent you an email this morning asking you about next week's work sessions? Please take a look at that and respond. I really need that information from you. And with that, Mr. Ripple, am I forgetting something?
I don't think so.
Okay, and I don't need a motion to adjourn, right? I can just say, all right. Well, I think with that, we're adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you Monday.